Tonight, I find myself remembering a phrase from a 1948 memo, Organized Political Warfare, and how those three words, buried in classified planning documents, would justify 6 decades of operations the American public was never meant to fully understand. This is part 2 of our examination of USAID. In part 1, we explored the structure, the budgets, the legislation, the institutional architecture. We documented how Kennedy consolidated 13 separate aid programs into a single agency in 1961. How Congress embedded legal protections in 1998 that made USAID nearly impossible to eliminate. How the transparency infrastructure of USA's pen.gov revealed transactions without explaining motives. We traced the evolution from Cold War competition with Soviet influence to contemporary strategic objectives, maintaining pharmaceutical dependencies through PEPFAR, projecting American presence across 100 countries, serving State Department foreign policy priorities that often contradicted development effectiveness. We saw the architecture. We understood the foundation. We recognized that USAID wasn't failing at its mission, it was succeeding at a mission. The public had never fully understood and Congress only partially acknowledged. Tonight, we go deeper. We follow the agency's operations into territories where development aid becomes something else entirely, where the line between humanitarian mission and covert action blurs until it disappears. We'll trace lineage from George Kennan's vision of political warfare conducted outside CIA. Oversight to contemporary programs where health initiatives conceal political objectives, where journalism funding shapes prosecutor behavior in target countries, where democracy promotion serves as cover for strategic destabilization. The structure we examined in Part 1 remains standing. The legal protections persist. The global infrastructure endures. But what operates within that architecture reveals purposes that development rhetoric carefully obscures. We're not exploring conspiracy theories. We're documenting policy established in National Security Council directives, implemented through grant agreements, assessed in Inspector General reports, and acknowledged in congressional testimony when senators attempted oversight and were told that operational security prevented disclosure. If this continuation helps you unwind after a long day, a like would mean a lot. Subscribe for more journeys into the machinery that shapes the world while most people sleep. Tell me in the comments if you listened to Parnand whether any of this changes how you see American foreign policy. Dim the lights. Let's return to 1948, to the moment when the architecture of deniability was first designed. I remember George F. Kennan's memo from April 30th, 1948, the inauguration of organized political warfare. Written just 12 days after the CIA's first major covert operation rigging Italy's election to prevent a communist victory. Kennan's 8-page document laid out a vision that would shape American foreign policy for the next 6 decades. The memo argued that the United States needed permanent institutional capacity for what Kennan called political warfare, operations that fell short of military conflict but went far beyond traditional diplomacy. Kennan defined political warfare broadly, the employment of all the means at a nation's command, short of war, to achieve its national objectives. This included overt activities like diplomatic pressure and economic assistance, but also covert operations, propaganda, subversion against hostile states, support of indigenous anti-communist elements in threatened countries of the free world. The critical insight wasn't that America should conduct such operations. Intelligence services had always engaged in covert action during wartime. Kennan's innovation was arguing that political warfare should be permanent, institutionalized, and conducted during peacetime as standard practice. The Cold War wasn't a temporary emergency requiring temporary measures. It was a permanent condition requiring permanent capabilities. But Kennan made an argument that would prove essential to USAID's eventual creation. He opposed placing political warfare exclusively within the CIA. The newly established intelligence agency, he argued, should focus on intelligence collection and analysis. Covert political operations required different skill sets, different cover mechanisms, different organizational cultures. Most importantly, they required the ability to operate under diplomatic and humanitarian cover where CIA involvement would be obvious and counterproductive. Kennan's memo recommended establishing political warfare. Capabilities within the State Department's orbiting agencies that could execute operations under official cover where congressional oversight would be lighter and public scrutiny minimal. Development assistance, cultural programs, information services. These provided natural cover for activities that served intelligence objectives without requiring presidential findings or CIA authorization. The recommendation reflected practical experience. The CIA's Italy operation had succeeded in preventing communist electoral victory, but the agency's involvement had been an open secret. Italian newspapers reported American interference. Soviet propagandists used the operation to claim that Western democracy was a facade for American imperialism. The operation achieved its immediate objective, but created long-term credibility costs that made future operations more difficult. What Kennan envisioned was something more sophisticated. Operations conducted through organizations that appeared independent of government control. Funding that flowed through humanitarian and development channels rather than intelligence appropriations. Personnel who could claim plausible deniability about their actual sponsors and objectives. Political warfare would be most effective when targets couldn't prove American involvement even when they suspected it. NSC 10 halves, issued on June 18, 1948, established the framework Kennan had advocated. The directive authorized a new organization initially called the Office of Special Projects, quickly renamed the Office of Policy Coordination to conduct covert operations. But critically, OPC would not operate solely under CIA control. Instead, it would receive policy guidance from state and defense departments, creating a bureaucratic structure where covert operations serve diplomatic and military objectives while maintaining intelligence, tradecraft. The directive defined covert operations as activities conducted or sponsored by this government against hostile foreign states or groups, or in support of friendly foreign states or groups, but which are so planned and executed that any U.S. government responsibility for them is not evident to unauthorized persons, and that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly disclaim any responsibility for them. That phrase, plausibly disclaim any responsibility, became the operational principle. Plausible deniability required more than secrecy. It required creating institutional arrangements where American involvement could be suspected but not proven, where operations could be attributed to other actors even when evidence suggested American sponsorship. I remember examining how this framework was implemented and recognizing that it created two parallel systems for projecting American power. The CIA would conduct operations that were completely covert secret from inception through execution. Deniable because no evidence of American involvement existed. But OPC would conduct operations that were semi-coverted visible activities conducted through ostensibly independent organizations that maintained cover as private entities, even when their funding and direction came from the U.S. government. This second category proved more valuable than pure covert action in many contexts. A completely secret CIA operation might overthrow a government, but it couldn't build long-term institutional relationships or create sustained influence. Semi-covert operations conducted through front organizations could establish enduring presence, develop networks of local collaborators, and shape political environments over years rather than through single decisive interventions. The labor movement provided an early template. The American Federation of Labor, working with State Department and OPC funding, established relationships with unions in Europe, Latin America, and eventually the developing world. These relationships served multiple purposes: strengthening anti-communist political movements, gathering intelligence on leftist organizations, creating networks through which American influence could flow. Union officials could plausibly claim independence from government control, even while receiving funding that was carefully laundered through foundations and intermediary organizations. Cultural programming followed similar patterns. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, established in 1950, brought together intellectuals and artists who opposed Soviet communism. The organization published magazines, sponsored conferences, and distributed books across Europe and eventually worldwide. For years, participants believed they were part of an independent movement of anti-totalitarian liberals. When CIA funding was exposed in 1967, the revelation damaged American cultural diplomacy for decades. But the model had proven effective enough that it continued in modified forms. Educational exchange programs operated under similar principles, bringing foreign students to American universities, funding scholars to conduct research in target countries, sponsoring academic conferences. These activities served intelligence collection, relationship building, and long-term influence development while maintaining cover as cultural and educational exchange. What connected these diverse programs was the architecture of deniability. Funding flowed through foundations that appeared private. Organizations maintained governance structures suggesting independence from government control. Personnel included genuine believers who didn't know about government. Sponsorship alongside handlers who coordinated with intelligence services. The model was sophisticated because it combined authentic activity. The cultural programs were real. The academic exchanges were genuine, with strategic direction that served covert objectives. I remember the bureaucratic arrangements that made this system function and recognizing how they prefigured USAID's later structure. OPC operated with unusual autonomy, receiving policy guidance from state and defense, but not direct operational control. This meant that when operations went wrong, responsibility was diffuse. State could claim it had only provided general guidance. Defense could argue it wasn't involved in implementation details. The CIA could maintain that OPC was technically separate, even though it existed within the intelligence community. This distributed accountability created what would become a permanent feature of American covert operations. Nobody was clearly responsible, which meant nobody could be held accountable when operations failed or created unintended consequences. Congressional oversights struggled because no single committee had jurisdiction over activities that crossed bureaucratic boundaries. Investigations could document specific operations but couldn't identify systemic patterns because the system was designed to resist comprehensive oversight. The early operations revealed both the utility and the limitations of plausible deniability. In Iran, in 1953, OPC worked with CIA to overthrow Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized British Petroleum's Iranian assets. The operation succeeded, reinstalling the Shah and preserving Western access to Iranian oil. But American involvement became an open secret, damaging U.S. credibility across the Middle East, and creating grievances that would explode during the 1979 revolution. In Guatemala in 1954, a similar operation removed President Jacobo Benz, whose land reforms threatened United Fruit Company holdings. The operation was officially attributed to indigenous Guatemalan opposition, but evidence of American involvement was overwhelming. Regional leaders understood that challenging U.S. corporate interests could result in regime change regardless of democratic legitimacy. These operations demonstrated that plausible deniability was most effective before operations were executed, less effective afterward when evidence accumulated and patterns became clear. The utility wasn't fooling sophisticated observers, Soviet intelligence. Allied governments, and even many Americans, understood what was happening. The utility was creating legal and political space where operations could be conducted without formal acknowledgement, where congressional authorization wasn't required, where oversight could be avoided by claiming that disclosure would endanger sources and methods. By the late 1950s, the architecture Kennan had envisioned was fully operational. Political warfare capabilities existed across multiple agencies. Covert operations could be routed through different bureaucratic channels, depending on their nature and required cover. State Department could conduct some activities directly. CIA could handle others. Organizational boundaries were deliberately blurred to maximize flexibility and minimize accountability. This was the context into which USAID was born in 1961. Kennedy's consolidation of 13 separate aid programs into a unified agency wasn't just administrative rationalization. It was creating another mechanism for political warfare under developmental cover. Development assistance could achieve what covert operations alone couldn't: sustain presence in target countries, legitimate relationships with governments and civil society, institutional capacity that could be leveraged for multiple purposes over time. The model Kennan had outlined in 1948 didn't require choosing between humanitarian assistance and covert operations. It required integrating them, creating systems where the same activities served multiple objectives simultaneously, where development programs that genuinely improved people's lives also advanced strategic interests that were never publicly acknowledged. I remember the philosophical foundation Kennan had laid and recognizing how it justified what would follow. Political warfare was described not as aggression, but as defensive necessity responding to Soviet operations that were already underway, protecting democratic institutions from totalitarian subversion, preserving freedom by using methods that might seem contradictory to democratic values but were essential to democracy's survival. This framing transformed covert operations from morally questionable activities requiring justification into strategic necessities requiring no apology. If the Soviets were conducting political warfare and they demonstrably were, then America had no choice but to respond in kind. The moral debate wasn't whether to conduct covert operations, but whether to conduct them effectively enough to win the larger competition. The architecture established in NSC 10 halves prioritized effectiveness over transparency, strategic success over democratic accountability. Operations would be conducted through whatever mechanisms worked, using whatever cover was available, with oversight limited to small groups of senior officials who could maintain secrecy. Congressional leaders would be briefed selectively, told enough to secure appropriations, but not so much that they could exercise genuine oversight. This system assumed that democratic publics couldn't be trusted with information about how their government actually operated abroad. That transparency would undermine effectiveness, that maintaining the Cold War struggle required methods that voters wouldn't approve if they understood them completely. The assumption wasn't entirely wrong. Public opinion polls consistently showed that Americans opposed covert operations when asked directly, even while supporting anti-communist objectives that couldn't be achieved through purely diplomatic means. The tension was inherent and unresolvable. Democratic governance required informed consent. Political warfare required secrecy and deniability. NSC 10 halves chose effectiveness over democratic accountability. I remember when the evidence emerged in leaked assessments and Inspector General investigations language, describing USAID operations as using the cover of health and civic programs to provoke political change. The phrasing was careful, bureaucratic, but the implications were clear. Programs presented as humanitarian assistance were designed to achieve political objectives, and this dual purpose created risks for personnel precisely because the operations weren't what they appeared to be. The pattern wasn't new. What changed in the post-9/11 era was the scale and sophistication of information operations, and how techniques originally developed for foreign environments began migrating inward. Counter-terrorism had accelerated development of psychological operations capabilities methods for shaping public opinion, influencing decision-makers, and mobilizing populations toward objectives they might not consciously understand they were serving. These PSYO peace techniques, refined in Iraq and Afghanistan, proved remarkably adaptable. The basic methodology was straightforward. Identify target audiences, map their information consumption patterns, develop narratives that would resonate with their existing beliefs and grievances, deliver those narratives through trusted messengers, and then coordinate messaging across multiple platforms to create the illusion of organic consensus. In foreign contexts, USAID provided ideal cover for these operations. Development programs created legitimate reasons for American personnel to be present in target countries, to build relationships with local media and civil society organizations, to understand information ecosystems well enough to influence them effectively. A program nominally designed to strengthen independent journalism could identify promising journalists, provide them with training and equipment, develop relationships that created subtle influence over their reporting priorities, and coordinate their work with broader strategic objectives, all while maintaining the appearance of supporting press freedom. The genius of the approach was that much of the activity was genuinely beneficial. Journalists did receive valuable training. Media organizations did gain technical capacity. Reporting quality often improved. The programs could be defended on their merits, even when their strategic purpose involved shaping information environments to advance American interests in ways that weren't publicly acknowledged. I remember examining specific program designs and recognizing how they incorporated SIOP methodology while maintaining developmental cover. Media development initiatives would conduct audience research ostensibly to help media organizations understand their markets, but producing intelligence about what narratives would be most effective in shaping public opinion. Training programs would emphasize specific reporting techniques described as professional standards, but actually orienting journalists toward covering stories that served strategic purposes. Civil society strengthening followed similar patterns. USAID would fund organizations that conducted legitimate advocacy work on human rights, governance, or environmental issues. But the funding came with informal guidance about priorities, about which issues to emphasize and which to downplay, about how to frame campaigns in ways that aligned with American interests. Recipients often didn't recognize this guidance as strategic direction because it was delivered through technical assistance and capacity building rather than explicit instructions. The programs created networks organizations in different countries that received USAID funding, attended similar training programs, used common methodologies, and coordinated their activities through international networks that appeared grassroots but were substantially shaped by American funding and strategic guidance. When these organizations mobilized simultaneously around similar issues using similar messaging, it created the appearance of global civil society consensus that was actually orchestrated coordination. What made this system powerful was plausible deniability at every level. USAID could claim it simply funded independent organizations and wasn't responsible for their specific activities. Implementing partners could claim they provided technical assistance without political direction. Recipient organizations could claim genuine independence because they made day-to-day decisions without American oversight. Each layer of separation made coordination harder to prove even when patterns suggested it clearly existed. The techniques proved so effective in foreign contexts that they inevitably attracted attention from domestic political actors. If micro-targeting could mobilize voters in developing democracies, why not in American elections? If coordinated messaging through seemingly independent sources could shift public opinion abroad, why not at home? If civil society networks could be constructed to advance policy objectives overseas, why not domestically? The migration of these techniques from foreign to domestic application accelerated after 2016. Concerns about foreign influence in elections creation, social media operations. Disinformation campaigns created political space for domestic information operations conducted under the banner of protecting democracy. Organizations that had developed expertise conducting USAID-funded media development and civil society programs abroad began offering similar services to domestic clients' political campaigns. Advocacy organizations, government agencies concerned about mis- and disinformation. I remembered the justifications offered for this expansion and how they paralleled arguments that had legitimized foreign information operations. Democracy faced threats from malign actors spreading false narratives. Protecting democratic institutions required actively shaping information environments. Citizens couldn't be trusted to sort truth from falsehood without guidance from authoritative sources. These arguments, which had justified information operations abroad for decades, now justified similar operations targeting American audiences. The organizational infrastructure that enabled this transfer was already in place. Think tanks and NGOs that had received USAID funding for foreign programs maintained expertise in information operations, audience analysis, and narrative development. Technology companies that had partnered with USAID abroad to build digital platforms and conduct online monitoring had capabilities that were equally applicable to domestic contexts. Academic institutions that had researched propaganda and disinformation for foreign applications could redirect that research toward domestic information environments. What emerged was an ecosystem of organizations nominally independent but substantially funded by government contracts and grants, conducting information operations that government agencies couldn't legally conduct directly, maintaining plausible deniability through separation that was legal rather than functional. The organizations could claim independence. The government could claim it wasn't conducting domestic propaganda, but the coordination was real, documented in grant agreements, program descriptions, and strategic planning documents that described objectives in careful language that obscured political purposes. The methods tested abroad proved devastatingly effective when applied domestically. Micro-targeting allowed messages to be customized for specific demographic and psychographic profiles. Coordinated amplification through multiple sources created false consensus. Narrative framing shaped how issues were understood before detailed information was available. Trusted messengers delivered government-aligned messages while maintaining credibility that official spokespersons lacked. Social media platforms became critical infrastructure for these operations. The same techniques used to counter terrorist propaganda content monitoring, account suspension, algorithmic suppression could be applied to domestic political content when framed as countering misinformation or extremism. Platform policies against hate speech, harassment, and false information created mechanisms to which government-aligned organizations could pressure companies to suppress disfavored narratives while amplifying preferred ones. I remember examining the funding flows and recognizing how they created dependencies that shaped platform behavior. USAID and State Department grants funded organizations that researched online hate speech and developed methodologies for identifying problematic content. These organizations then worked with platforms to implement their methodologies, often without disclosing their government funding. Platforms incorporated the guidance to demonstrate they were addressing problems that generated political and regulatory pressure. The result was government influence over content moderation that maintained plausible deniability because the influence was indirect, flowing through seemingly independent researchers and advocacy organizations. The classified nature of many programs made comprehensive documentation impossible, but patterns were visible in what could be documented. Organizations receiving USAID funding for media development abroad also contracted with Department of Homeland Security to combat domestic misinformation. Think tanks funded through State Department grants produced research on online extremism that shaped platform policies. Academic centers receiving intelligence community funding developed tools for detecting coordinated, inauthentic behavior that were applied to domestic political campaigns. The legal framework that had constrained these activities, primarily the Smith-Mundt Act's prohibition on domestic dissemination of government propaganda, had been substantially weakened by the 2012 modernization. What remained were ethical norms and informal constraints that proved insufficient when political incentives pushed toward more aggressive domestic information operations. Personnel moved fluidly between government agencies, implementing organizations, and technology platforms carrying expertise and relationships that enabled coordination even when formal authority was absent. A former USAID officer might join an NGO conducting media development, maintaining relationships with former colleagues that enabled informal coordination. A State Department official might move to a technology company, bringing understanding of government priorities that shaped corporate policies. These relationships created networks through which influence flowed without requiring explicit direction. The operations weren't monolithic or centrally controlled. Different agencies pursued different objectives, sometimes in coordination and sometimes in competition. But the overall effect was information environments shaped by government influence that wasn't transparently acknowledged, where seemingly independent sources actually reflected strategic priorities. The public discourse was manipulated through techniques that most participants didn't recognize and couldn't effectively resist. What distinguished this system from crude propaganda was sophistication. Messages weren't obviously government-sponsored. Narratives incorporated authentic concerns and legitimate grievances. Messengers included genuine believers who didn't know they were amplifying strategically designed content. The operations were effective precisely because they were largely invisible, creating the appearance of organic public opinion while actually reflecting orchestrated campaigns. I remember specific cases where the mechanics became visible through disclosure requirements or investigative reporting. A disinformation research organization that regularly briefed government officials about domestic political content turned out to receive substantial government funding through grants that weren't disclosed when it presented its work as independent academic research. A media monitoring group that pressured platforms to suppress content about election integrity received funding from agencies with clear political interests in shaping election narratives. An anti-extremism initiative that targeted domestic political movements was substantially funded through Homeland Security grants that created obvious conflicts of interest. Each revelation generated brief controversy, but the underlying infrastructure persisted because it served purposes that political actors across the spectrum found valuable. Conservatives wanted tools to combat what they viewed as left-wing media bias and big tech censorship. Progressives wanted mechanisms to counter right-wing misinformation and online hate speech. Both sides built capacity for information operations when they held power, creating institutional capabilities that persisted through political transitions and became available to their successors. The USAID connection was particularly important because it provided mechanisms for funding information operations. Through development and democracy promotion appropriations that faced less scrutiny than intelligence or domestic security spending, a grant for strengthening independent media could fund organizations conducting domestic information operations as long as the primary activities nominally occurred abroad. A civil society program could support domestic advocacy that served strategic objectives while maintaining cover as supporting democratic. I remember when there was a wall between foreign propaganda operations and domestic audiences. The Smith-Mundt Act of 1948 passed the same year Kennan wrote his political warfare memo, and NSC 10 halves established the covert operations framework, created a legal prohibition that would shape American information operations for 6 decades. The Act's full name the United States Information and Educational Exchange Act suggested. Its primary purpose was enabling government communication with foreign audiences. State Department and the newly created United States Information Agency could produce radio broadcasts, films, pamphlets, and other materials designed to present American values and counter Soviet propaganda abroad. The Voice of America could broadcast into the Eastern Bloc. Cultural programs could showcase American achievements to audiences in developing countries. But Congress included a critical constraint. Section 501 prohibited domestic dissemination of materials produced for foreign audiences. The State Department couldn't distribute within the United States the same materials it produced for overseas consumption. The restriction wasn't absolute. Materials could be made available to researchers, journalists, and Congress upon request, but active dissemination to domestic audiences was forbidden. The legislative history revealed Congress's concerns. Members worried that propaganda capabilities developed for foreign audiences would be turned against American citizens, that the executive branch would use taxpayer dollars to manipulate domestic opinion, that government information operations would undermine democratic discourse by creating false consensus or suppressing dissent. The prohibition wasn't about preventing government communication with citizens. That occurred constantly through official announcements, press conferences, and public affairs offices. It was about preventing covert manipulation, operations where government sponsorship was concealed or where sophisticated techniques developed for influencing foreign populations were applied domestically. The distinction mattered because foreign propaganda operations used methods that would be inappropriate for communicating with American citizens. Materials could present selective information designed to create specific impressions without providing context that would enable critical evaluation. Narratives could be crafted to exploit local prejudices, grievances, and cultural assumptions. Sources could be obscured to make government messaging appear to emerge organically from trusted local voices. Techniques that were considered legitimate for competing with Soviet propaganda abroad would be recognized as manipulation if applied to American audiences. I remember the Cold War cases where this firewall was tested and how they revealed both its utility and its limitations. When Voice of America broadcasts reached American audiences through atmospheric conditions, or when Americans living abroad encountered USAID materials, questions arose about whether this constituted domestic dissemination. The State Department maintained that incidental domestic exposure didn't violate the Act as long as materials weren't intentionally distributed within the United States. More problematic were cases where information operations abroad affected American political discourse. Indirectly, when CIA funded the Congress for Cultural Freedom and other organizations that published in American outlets or influenced American intellectuals, the domestic impact was obvious, even though the operations technically occurred abroad. When development assistance and cultural programs shaped foreign governments' policies in ways that generated American media coverage, domestic opinion was influenced through foreign operations that Smith-Mundt didn't regulate. These indirect effects suggested the firewall's limitations. In an interconnected information environment, strict separation between foreign and domestic was difficult to maintain. Materials produced for foreign audiences would inevitably reach Americans. Operations conducted abroad would affect domestic politics through media coverage and policy debates. The prohibition prevented direct domestic dissemination, but couldn't prevent indirect influence. Nevertheless, for 64 years the firewall held Government agencies conducting information operations abroad accepted that those operations couldn't legally target American audiences, that techniques appropriate for foreign contexts were constrained domestically, that transparency requirements and democratic norms limited what could be done at home, even when similar activities occurred overseas, without controversy. Then came the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012, buried within the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2013. The amendment repealed the domestic dissemination prohibition. Materials could be produced that concealed their origins. Coordination between government and ostensibly independent sources could occur without transparency that would enable public evaluation. The practical effects became visible in subsequent years. Organizations receiving State Department and USAID funding for foreign media development began conducting similar programs domestically. Think tanks funded through foreign assistance appropriations produced research about domestic myths and disinformation. Training programs developed for foreign journalists were adapted for American media outlets. The infrastructure built for foreign information operations was repurposed for domestic application. When USAID funds global information networks, media organizations, civil society groups, research centers on those networks, content enters domestic media without disclosure of government funding. The circuit completes. Foreign influence operations become domestic narrative control, flowing through channels that maintain plausible deniability about government direction even when coordination is clearly occurring. The modernization also affected how platforms approached content moderation. With Smith-Mundt restrictions removed, government agencies could more directly pressure technology companies about domestic content. Organizations receiving government funding could flag problematic posts, recommend account suspensions, and shape platform policies without the same concerns about legal constraints that had existed when domestic information operations faced stricter prohibitions. I remember the distinction that had been lost and recognizing why it had mattered. Foreign propaganda operations assumed adversarial contexts where manipulation was expected and targets understood they were receiving strategic communications, designed to advance American interests. Domestic government communications assumed cooperative contexts where citizens deserved honest information, enabling informed democratic participation. Collapsing this distinction meant treating American citizens as targets of information warfare rather than as constituents, entitled to transparent communication from their government. The legal change reflected broader shifts in how political actors viewed information environments. Increasingly, domestic political competition was understood through frameworks developed for international conflict adversaries conducting information operations, narratives as weapons, public opinion as territory, to be captured and held. These martial metaphors legitimized tactics that would have been rejected as undemocratic manipulation, under frameworks that viewed citizens as participants in collective self-governance rather than as targets to be influenced through sophisticated psychological techniques. The modernization created legal authority for activities that were already occurring but had operated in gray zones where legality was questionable. Government agencies had long found ways to influence domestic opinion through foreign operations that were technically legal under Smith-Mundt, but clearly designed to shape American politics. The 2012 change simply removed legal ambiguity. explicitly authorizing what had previously required elaborate workarounds and legal interpretations that stretched credibility. What the modernization didn't change was the underlying prohibition on government propaganda in appropriations law. Congress still included language in annual appropriations, bills stating that funds couldn't be used for publicity or propaganda, purposes not authorized by Congress. But this restriction proved ineffective when government funded ostensibly independent organizations that conducted information operations. The organizations weren't government, so anti-propaganda restrictions didn't apply to them, even when their funding came entirely from federal grants and their activities were coordinated with government priorities. The architecture of plausible deniability that NSC 10 halves had established for foreign operations now applied domestically. Government could influence public opinion through organizations that maintained legal independence, through funding that was disclosed in grant databases but not when organizations presented their work publicly, through coordination that occurred informally and couldn't be documented through official records that were subject to Freedom of Information Act requests. I remember standing back from this legal history and recognizing the trajectory. The 1948 Smith-Mundt Act had created a firewall. I remember when the scale became clear through OCCRP's own financial disclosures and the investigative reporting that eventually turned on the organization itself. The Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, established in 2006, had grown into the largest consortium of investigative journalists on Earth, a network spanning multiple continents, coordinating dozens of member organizations, breaking major stories that shaped political outcomes in target countries. OCCRP's funding structure was documented in annual reports and grant databases. The U.S. government provided slightly more than half of the annual funding through USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the State Department. Other funding came from European governments and private foundations. But American taxpayers were the primary sponsors of what appeared to be an independent journalism organization. The relationship went beyond simple funding. OCCRP's founder acknowledged in interviews that USAID maintained veto rights over senior staff hiring decisions. This wasn't informal influence or subtle pressure, it was contractual authority giving a U.S. government agency direct control over personnel decisions at what was nominally an independent media organization. When critics called OCCRP state-sponsored media for hire, they were describing a structural relationship that was documented in grant agreements rather than making conspiratorial accusations. The organization's work was undeniably significant. OCCRP broke the Panama Papers story, coordinating with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, to expose offshore financial networks that enabled tax evasion and money laundering globally. The Paradise Papers followed, revealing how corporations and wealthy individuals used legal structures to avoid taxes and conceal assets. The Azerbaijan laundromat, the Russian laundromat, the Troika laundromat investigations documenting billions in illicit financial flows through Western banking systems. Each investigation represented genuine journalism, meticulous documentation, source protection, coordination with legal experts to ensure accuracy. The reporting was technically proficient and editorially rigorous. OCCRP won international awards and generated worldwide media coverage. Its investigations were cited in academic research, policy debates, and legal proceedings. but the pattern of targets revealed strategic alignment that was difficult to dismiss as coincidental. OCCRP investigations focused heavily on corruption in countries whose governments opposed U.S. interest assuracia: Venezuela, Azerbaijan, various former Soviet republics. Corruption in countries aligned with American interests received less attention. Saudi Arabia's financial flows, Israeli money laundering, corruption in Egypt or Jordan, these topics generated fewer investigations despite abundant evidence that financial misconduct was equally prevalent in U.S.-aligned states. I remember the documented impact and recognizing how it demonstrated OCCRP's strategic value. The organization's own metrics claimed its investigations had generated $4.5 billion in fines levied against targets, 548 policy changes, 21 resignations and sackings of government officials, and 456 arrests and indictments. These numbers represented political destabilization, measured in quantifiable terms. The return on investment calculation was straightforward. USAID had invested approximately $20 million in OCCRP over the organization's existence. If the claimed impacts were accurate, that represented a 22,500% return, $225 in fines, policy changes and prosecutions for every dollar of U.S. government funding. Even accounting for European and foundation contributions that reduced the U.S. government's proportional investment, the strategic value was extraordinary. But the calculation only worked if you measured success by political destabilization rather than journalistic integrity. Fines against Russian oligarchs weakened Putin's support network. Arrests of Venezuelan officials undermined Maduro's government. Policy changes in former Soviet republics moved countries away from Russian influence toward Western alignment. Each outcome served U.S. strategic interests while maintaining cover as independent journalism exposing corruption. The mechanism was sophisticated. OCCRP would investigate and publish documentation of financial misconduct. Prosecutors in Western countries, particularly in the United States and European Union, would use the published evidence to launch legal proceedings. The investigations provided prosecutors with roadmaps for cases they might not have developed independently, complete with source documents, transaction records, and narrative frameworks that could be adapted to legal pleadings. The Rudy Giuliani case illustrated the model's application to American political figures. OCCRP published investigations of Giuliani's business dealings in Ukraine, documenting his relationships with Ukrainian oligarchs and his work on behalf of foreign clients while serving as President Trump's personal attorney. The reporting provided ammunition for prosecutors pursuing Giuliani for unregistered foreign agent work and campaign finance violations. Whether Giuliani was guilty of the charges was a separate question from whether OCCRP's investigation served strategic purposes beyond journalism. The timing of the reporting coinciding with impeachment proceedings against Trump suggested coordination with political objectives. The focus on Giuliani, while largely ignoring Hunter Biden's Ukrainian business dealings, suggested selective application of investigative scrutiny based on political alignment. I remember examining how this model transformed journalism into an instrument of foreign policy. Traditional investigative reporting involved journalists identifying stories independently, conducting research without government direction, and publishing findings regardless of political implications. Editorial independence was the foundation of journalism's credibility. Reporters covered stories because they were newsworthy, not because coverage served government interests. OCCRP maintained the appearance of editorial independence, while operating within constraints that fundamentally compromised it. The organization could choose which specific stories to pursue within target countries, but the targeting itself reflected funding priorities. Journalists could investigate corruption wherever they found it, but investigations in countries that were USAID priorities received more resources, more coordination, and more prominent publication. The system was self-reinforcing. Successful investigations generated more funding because they demonstrated impact that justified continued investment. Stories that aligned with U.S. strategic interests received more international media pickup, amplifying their political effects. Journalists within OCCRP who produced investigations, valuable to funding sources, advanced within the organization and gained access to better resources for future work. This created incentive structures that shaped editorial decisions without requiring explicit direction. Journalists learned what kinds of stories would be well-resourced and promoted. They understood which targets would generate institutional support and which would face obstacles. The influence was cultural rather than conspiratorial, operating through professional incentives rather than direct censorship. The broader network amplified OCCRP's impact. Member organizations in dozens of countries operated with similar funding models, partly supported by government grants, partly by foundations that were themselves influenced by government priorities. When OCCRP developed an investigation, member organizations would localize it, publishing versions adapted to their country's contexts. This created the appearance of global journalistic consensus that was actually coordinated publication by a government-funded network. The model undermined the distinction between journalism and intelligence operations. Intelligence agencies had always cultivated relationships with journalists, using them as sources and occasionally as instruments for placing stories that served strategic purposes. But OCCRP represented something more systematic, an entire journalism infrastructure substantially funded by government, targeting government priorities, coordinating with prosecutors who served government interests, while maintaining the appearance and legal status of independent media. I remember the legal protections that made this arrangement possible and recognizing how they paralleled the architecture of deniability established for other covert operations. Press freedom meant government couldn't be held responsible for what independent journalists published, even when government funded those journalists. Editorial independence meant funders couldn't be blamed for specific stories, even when funding priorities clearly shaped coverage patterns. The organizational structure created separation between State Department and published investigations, even when the connection was direct through documented funding and contractual veto rights. Critics who characterized OCCRP as publishing investigative hit pieces were identifying real patterns, even if the language was inflammatory. The investigations were technically accurate, the financial misconduct document was real. The sources were reliable, the legal analysis was sound. But the selection of targets and the timing of publications served strategic purposes that had nothing to do with journalistic values and everything to do with advancing U.S. interests through what appeared to be independent accountability journalism. The danger to journalism was profound. If major investigations could be understood as government-funded operations serving strategic interests, public trust in all journalism would erode. When readers couldn't distinguish between independent reporting and state-sponsored investigations maintaining cover as journalism, skepticism would extend to legitimate accountability reporting that actually operated independently. OCCRP's defenders argued that investigating corruption served public interest regardless of funding sources, that exposing financial misconduct was valuable even when it aligned with government priorities, that the journalism was legitimate even if it served strategic purposes. These arguments had merit. Corruption deserved exposure, financial crimes warranted prosecution, and good journalism was good journalism regardless of motivation. But the argument ignored how government funding corrupted the appearance of independence that was essential to journalism's credibility. Even if OCCRP's reporting was accurate and its editors maintained integrity, the structural relationship with government sponsors meant the organization couldn't be considered independent. I remember when researchers at the World Bank identified what they called the perverse incentive embedded in judicial reform programs are. Dynamics so fundamental it seemed to explain why billions in assistance produce such modest institutional change. Officials in corrupt debtor countries, the analysis concluded, prioritized financial liquidity over institutional reform. This wasn't a moral failing. It was rational behavior within the incentive structures that foreign assistance created. The logic was straightforward. Governments receiving large aid appropriations needed to spend money efficiently to maintain good relationships with donors and ensure continued funding flows. This created pressure toward investments that can absorb huge amounts of capital, quickly courthouse construction projects, computer system installations, vehicle purchases, building renovations. These expenditures demonstrated capacity to manage large budgets and created visible symbols of reform that could be photographed for progress reports. Actual institutional reform, changing legal procedures, restructuring court administration, strengthening judicial independence, was slow, politically difficult, and resistant to rapid capital absorption. Training judges required years. Reforming case management systems demanded sustained engagement with entrenched bureaucracies. Strengthening independence meant reducing executive control over courts, which governments had obvious incentives to resist. The result was predictable. Aid money flowed toward capital-intensive projects with modest concern for whether they achieved institutional transformation. Courthouses were built in countries where judicial corruption meant the facilities would simply house corrupt proceedings in nicer buildings. Computer systems were installed where lack of judicial independence meant digitization would merely make biased decisions more efficient. The infrastructure improved while the institutions remained fundamentally unchanged. USAID's governance and judicial reform programs operated within this structural challenge throughout their existence. From early programs in Latin America during the 1980s to contemporary initiatives across Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe, the pattern repeated: large appropriations, pressure to spend efficiently, investments in visible infrastructure, modest outcomes despite massive expenditure. I remember examining program evaluations and recognizing how carefully they documented activities while obscuring impact. Reports would detail courthouse construction completed, judges trained, computers distributed, legal codes revised. The metrics were impressive: hundreds of judges receiving training, dozens of courthouses renovated, thousands of computers installed, comprehensive legal reforms enacted. But the assessments rarely demonstrated that these activities translated into functional rule of law. Crime remained unprosecuted. Contracts went unenforced. Property rights remained insecure. Political opponents faced selective prosecution. Judicial decisions reflected executive preferences rather than legal analysis. The infrastructure existed, but the institution functioned as it always had, serving power rather than constraining it. The institutional economics explained why. Judicial reform threatened entrenched interests, politicians who used courts to neutralize opponents, business elites who benefited from selective enforcement, security services that operated with judicial impunity. These actors had strong incentives to accept aid money for courthouses while blocking reforms that would constrain their power. And the aid system's emphasis on rapid capital absorption meant donors had limited leverage to demand reforms that would slow spending and risk leaving appropriations unobligated at fiscal year end. Some programs achieved genuine successes. Professional court administrators were trained and changed how courts manage cases. Modern case management systems improved efficiency in jurisdictions where judges were committed to using them properly. Legal education programs strengthened professional standards for attorneys and judges who took their training seriously. These successes were real, documented in evaluations and visible in improved court performance. But the critique suggested these successes existed despite the aid model rather than because of it. The programs that worked typically involved sustained engagement over decades with local champions, who were committed to reform regardless of foreign assistance. The aid money helped, but it wasn't the decisive factor. Countries that wanted judicial reform achieved it. Countries that didn't want reform accepted aid money, built infrastructure, and maintained institutional continuity behind modernized facades. I remember the strategic implications becoming clear through leaked assessments and congressional testimony. If judicial reform programs consistently failed to achieve institutional transformation despite massive spending, either USAID was incompetent at program design or institutional transformation wasn't the actual objective. The pattern suggested the latter, that aid money's real function was creating dependencies and access, rather than sustainable reform. The dependencies operated at multiple levels. Governments became accustomed to aid flows and structured budgets around expected assistance. This gave USAID leverage in unrelated policy areas. Development assistance could be conditioned on cooperation with broader American interests. Courthouses built with American funding required American-supplied maintenance and equipment upgrades. Computer systems needed software licenses and technical support from American contractors. Each dependency created ongoing relationships that could be leveraged for strategic purposes having nothing to do with judicial reform. The access points were equally valuable. Judicial reform programs required USAID personnel to work closely with justice ministries, courts, prosecutors' offices, and police agencies. These relationships provided intelligence about government operations, enabled identification of officials who might be recruited as sources or influenced to serve American interests, and created cover for activities that went beyond technical assistance into political intelligence collection. Training programs brought foreign judges and officials to the United States or to regional training centers where they could be assessed for recruitment potential. Professional exchanges created relationships that persisted after formal programs ended. Workshops and conferences gathered officials from multiple countries. enabling USAID to map networks and identify opportunities for regional coordination. Each program generated intelligence and access that had strategic value independent of whether it achieved stated development objectives. The funding mechanisms made this dual purpose sustainable. Judicial reform appropriations came through governance and democracy budgets that faced less scrutiny than intelligence spending. Programs could be justified through development rhetoric while serving intelligence collection and strategic influence objectives. When questioned about limited institutional impact, USAID could point to infrastructure built and training delivered while avoiding discussion of whether these activities achieved rule of law development. That was nominally the purpose. I remember specific country cases where the pattern was particularly visible. In Afghanistan, USAID spent hundreds of millions on judicial reform over 2 decades. Courthouses were built across provinces, judges received training in modern legal procedures, case management systems were installed, legal codes were revised to align with international standards. Yet by the time of American withdrawal in 2021, Afghanistan's judicial system remained fundamentally dysfunctional. Judges were selected based on political loyalty rather than legal competence. Decisions reflected tribal customs and political pressure rather than written law. Corruption was endemic. The formal structures existed, but there were facades over traditional power arrangements that foreign assistance had barely touched. The program could be viewed as failure billions spent with negligible institutional impact, or it could be viewed as success if the objective was maintaining American presence and relationships with Afghan officials rather than achieving genuine judicial reform. The infrastructure created reasons for American personnel to remain in provinces. Relationships with judges and prosecutors provided intelligence about local power structures, and the program's continuation signaled American commitment, regardless of whether it transformed institutions. Similar patterns emerged in Iraq, where judicial reform programs operated parallel to military occupation. In Egypt, where assistance continued despite obvious judicial subservience to executive power. In Pakistan, where programs persisted through governments that used courts to persecute political opponents. In each case, limited institutional reform coexisted with sustained American presence and access that served strategic purposes beyond development assistance. The corruption within programs added another layer. Inspector General investigations documented contractors billing for training that was never delivered, charging for equipment that was never installed, claiming expenses for personnel who never existed. These weren't isolated incidents, but predictable consequences of operating at scale. Across countries with weak accountability systems and contractors who understood that monitoring was limited and consequences for fraud were modest compared to profits from inflated billings. The moral hazard was structural. Contractors were selected partly based on their ability to rapidly spend large appropriations. This created incentives to maximize spending rather than maximize impact. Proposals that promised to spend money quickly were favored over proposals that promised sustainable reform through slower, more careful engagement. The system selected for contractors who excelled at appearing busy while achieving minimal transformation. I remember examining the administrative costs of managing these programs and recognizing they consumed resources that might have achieved more if spent differently. USAID employed substantial staff to design programs, monitor contractors, evaluate outcomes, and report to Congress. contractors employed layers of management to coordinate with USAID document activities and produce deliverables that satisfied grant requirements regardless of whether they achieved development objectives. These administrative costs were defended as necessary oversight to prevent fraud and ensure accountability. But the oversight itself became a performance. Contractors learned what documentation satisfied requirements while continuing problematic practices. Evaluations were conducted by firms hired by the same contractors being evaluated, and reporting emphasized silly measured activities rather than difficult to assess institutional change. The fundamental problem was that genuine judicial reform required political will from recipient governments, sustained engagement over decades, and willingness to challenge entrenched interests. Foreign assistance could support these processes where political will existed, but it couldn't create political will where it was absent. And USAID's operational model, large appropriations requiring rapid spending, contractor implementation, creating separation from accountability, emphasis on visible deliverables rather than sustained engagement, was poorly suited to supporting long-term institutional transformation. The critique wasn't that judicial reform was impossible or that foreign assistance couldn't contribute to it. Evidence from successful cases demonstrated that careful, sustained support for local reformers could strengthen institutions over time. The critique was, I remember when the Inspector General's commitment to rooting out fraud and corruption within U.S. foreign assistance programs was tested not by theoretical challenges, but by the sheer volume of documented malfeasance. The cases accumulated in OIG reports year after years before detection, involving officials who had passed security clearances and contractors who had previously performed successfully on government contracts. In one case that reached federal court in 2009, a USAID official and 3 corporate executives pled guilty to involvement in a decade-long bribery scheme related to government contract awards. The scheme wasn't sophisticated cash payments in exchange for contract steering, the kind of corruption that occurs in government contracting across agencies and contexts. What distinguished this case was its duration. 10 years of operation meant multiple contract cycles, numerous opportunities for detection, and systematic failure of internal controls that were supposedly designed to prevent exactly this type of misconduct. The details revealed how the scheme functioned. The USAID official had authority over contract evaluations and award recommendations. Corporate executives seeking favorable treatment provided cash payments, gifts, and other benefits. The official steered contracts toward paying companies, while ensuring that competing bids were scored lower during evaluation processes. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. Contractors received lucrative awards, the official received payments, and the fraud was concealed through evaluation procedures that appeared legitimate on paper. Detection came not through USAID's internal controls, but through a separate investigation that uncovered financial irregularities leading back to the scheme. This pattern repeated across OIG cases. Fraud was typically discovered through external events rather than internal monitoring. Whistleblowers made allegations after being excluded from schemes. Suspicious financial transactions triggered banking investigations that revealed government contract connections. Failed business relationships led to participants reporting schemes they had previously benefited from. I remember examining the structural conditions that enabled persistent fraud and recognizing they were inherent to USAID's operational model. The sheer volume of financial assistance, billions, and newly created opportunities at every transaction point. Hundreds of contractors competed for awards, creating incentives for corruption in evaluation processes. Thousands of subcontractors performed work in remote locations with limited oversight. Millions of individual transactions occurred across dozens of countries with varying levels of institutional integrity and accountability. This scale made comprehensive monitoring impossible. The OIG employed several hundred investigators, auditors, and analysts attempting to oversee programs spending tens of billions annually across more than 100 countries. Even aggressive investigation couldn't review more than a small fraction of transactions. Audits examined samples rather than populations. Site visits covered selected locations rather than all implementation areas. Financial reviews looked for anomalies in reporting rather than verifying every expenditure. The monitoring that did occur focused on compliance rather than effectiveness. Auditors verified that contractors followed procurement regulations, maintained required documentation, and reported expenditures in proper categories. This compliance monitoring could identify procedural violations, but struggled to detect sophisticated fraud where documentation was falsified to appear legitimate. Contractors understood these limitations and structured fraud accordingly, rather than simply stealing money, which left obvious evidence in missing funds and unexplained transactions. Sophisticated schemes inflated costs on legitimate activities. Training programs reported more participants than actually attended. Equipment purchases claimed higher costs than actually paid. Personnel expenses included positions that existed on paper but weren't actually working. These inflations were difficult to detect without extensive verification that monitoring resources couldn't support at scale. The moral hazard extended beyond individual fraud to systemic inefficiency. Even honest contractors had incentives to maximize billable costs rather than minimize expenses. Costs plus contracts meant higher costs, generated higher fees. Time and materials, arrangements, rewarded slower work. Fixed-price contracts created incentives to cut corners on quality while maintaining appearances. Each contracting mechanism created different incentive problems, and contractors learned to exploit whichever mechanism applied to their awards. I remember the geographic dimension of fraud risk and how it correlated with USAID's strategic priorities. Programs in conflict zones and unstable countries faced elevated fraud risk. Because oversight was limited by security conditions, monitoring visits couldn't occur when sites were too dangerous for American personnel. Financial verification was difficult when local banking systems were unreliable. Documentation requirements were relaxed when contractors argued that normal procedures were impossible in emergency conditions. But these high-risk environments were often where USAID operated most extensively because they aligned with strategic priorities. Afghanistan and Iraq received massive assistance despite obvious fraud risks because maintaining American presence was strategically essential. Conflict zones in Africa received funding despite limited monitoring capacity because counter-terrorism objectives required engagement. The strategic imperative to operate in difficult environments meant accepting elevated fraud risk as a cost of strategic presence. The administrative costs of managing fraud risk consumed resources that might have been spent on programs. The OIG employed hundreds of personnel conducting investigations, audits, and program reviews. USAID employed compliance staff who reviewed contractor documentation, processed reports, and coordinated with investigators. Contractors employed personnel who managed documentation requirements, prepared for audits, and responded to inquiries. These administrative costs were justified as necessary to ensure accountability, but they diverted resources from development activities toward oversight activities that caught only a fraction of fraud, while imposing burdens on honest contractors. The prosecutions that did occur rarely recovered significant funds. Criminal cases required proof beyond reasonable doubt, which was difficult to establish in international contexts, where documentation was limited and witnesses were uncooperative. Civil recoveries through False Claims Act litigation recovered some funds, but typically reached settlements for fractions of proven losses. Contractor debarment removed bad actors, but created gaps in capacity that had to be filled by remaining contractors who understood they faced limited competition. I remember specific cases beyond the 2009 bribery scheme that illustrated patterns rather than anomalies. A contractor in Afghanistan submitted invoices for security services that were never provided, collecting millions before the fraud was discovered. When a subcontractor complained about non-payment, a contractor in Haiti billed for medical supplies that were never delivered, substituting lower quality alternatives or charging for premium products. A contractor in South Sudan claimed expenses for non-existent staff, maintaining payroll documentation for positions that were never filled. Each case involved brazen conduct fraud that would have been easily detected with basic verification. But the verification didn't occur until problems accumulated enough to trigger investigations. The system relied on deterrence through occasional prosecution rather than prevention through comprehensive monitoring, accepting that substantial fraud would occur as a predictable cost of operations at scale. The pattern wasn't unique to USAID. Large federal agencies operating globally faced similar challenges. Defense Department contracting fraud in Iraq and Afghanistan, State Department security contractor misconduct, intelligence community procurement irregularities. The commonalities suggested that fraud at scale was an inherent feature of government operations in complex environments, rather than a problem that could be solved through better management. But USAID's particular vulnerability came from its dual mandate. Operating as a development agency required maintaining relationships with local partners who lacked sophisticated financial controls. Operating as an instrument of strategic policy required presence in high-risk environments where oversight was limited. The combination created elevated fraud risk that couldn't be eliminated, without fundamentally changing either the development mission or the strategic utility. The agency's response emphasized strengthening internal controls, more detailed reporting requirements, additional approval layers, expanded audit procedures. These controls imposed costs on all contractors while having modest impact on sophisticated fraud that adapted to new requirements. Honest contractors complained about compliance burdens that diverted resources from program implementation. Fraudulent contractors adapted documentation to satisfy new requirements while continuing misconduct. I remember examining the cost-benefit calculation implicit in USAID's fraud tolerance and recognizing its brutal logic. Preventing all fraud would require monitoring so intensive it would consume resources exceeding likely fraud losses. Accepting some fraud as inevitable operational cost was economically rational, even if it was morally problematic and politically embarrassing when cases became public. The calculation assumed that fraud losses were modest compared to total appropriations, that even if hundreds of millions were lost to fraud annually, This represented small percentages of total spending. The assumption was probably accurate, but it ignored the credibility costs when fraud cases became public, the deterrent effect of unpunished misconduct, and the cynicism created among honest contractors who competed against fraudulent actors who gained advantages through misconduct that went unpunished for years. The strategic implications extended beyond development effectiveness to USAID's utility for covert operations. If contracting mechanisms enabled fraud that diverted development funds to personal enrichment, the same mechanisms could enable diversion of funds to purposes that weren't documented in grant agreements paying local assets, funding political movements, supporting covert operations that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The line between fraud and covert funding was difficult to distinguish in operational practice. The OIG documented suspicious patterns, but couldn't always determine whether unexplained expenditures represented fraud or I remember when the Inspector General explicitly addressed what had been whispered in classified briefings and congressional testimony for years: the risk of diversion of taxpayer-funded aid to terrorist organizations. The language was careful, framed as risk management rather than documented occurrence. But the OIG's mandate to investigate these diversions wouldn't exist if they were merely theoretical possibilities. The structural problem was clear. USAID operated in environments where humanitarian need intersected with active conflict, where populations requiring assistance were controlled by groups designated as terrorists or hostile to American interests, where aid delivery required cooperation with local power structures that included the very adversaries. American military and intelligence operations were combating. In these contexts, aid diversion wasn't an aberration. Requiring extraordinary security failure was a calculated risk inherent to maintaining operations. The strategic calculus was brutal but logical. Withdrawing assistance from territories controlled by adversarial groups meant abandoning populations to humanitarian crises and ceding influence to whoever would provide aid, often Iranian, Russian, or Chinese actors who faced no domestic political constraints about cooperating with groups Americans designated as terrorists. Maintaining assistance despite diversion risks meant accepting that some percentage of aid would be captured by adversaries, but preserving American presence and influence in contested territories. Syria provided the most extensively documented case, as civil war fragmented the country. USAID maintained operations in opposition-controlled territories where various armed groups competed for dominance. Food assistance, medical supplies, and other humanitarian aid flowed through implementing partners who operated in areas where Al-Qaeda affiliates exercised substantial control. Reports emerged of hundreds of thousands of meals that went to Al-Qaeda-affiliated fighters, diversions that were predictable given operational realities, but politically explosive. When documented, I remembered the implementation mechanisms and recognizing how they created diversion vulnerabilities, while maintaining plausible deniability about American responsibility. USAID didn't deliver aid directly in conflict zones. It contracted with international NGOs who subcontracted to local organizations who hired staff and transported supplies. Each layer of separation provided operational flexibility but reduced accountability. When aid was diverted, USAID could claim lack of direct control. Implementing partners could claim they weren't responsible for what subcontractors did. Subcontractors could claim they operated under duress in territories where armed groups demanded tribute as the price of access. The diversion occurred through multiple mechanisms. Armed groups imposed taxes on aid deliveries demanding portions of food, medical supplies, or cash payments as the cost of allowing humanitarian organizations to operate in territories they controlled. These payments could be characterized as extortion rather than voluntary cooperation, maintaining legal cover that organizations were coerced rather than complicit. But the effect was the some American taxpayer funds supporting groups engaged in active combat against U.S. Allied forces. Personnel were another diversion vector. Local staff hired by implementing organizations in conflict zones might be affiliated with armed groups, drawing salaries while providing intelligence or facilitating diversion. Vetting was difficult when security databases were limited, when local populations had complex relationships with multiple armed factions, when refusing employment to individuals with suspected connections meant organizations couldn't staff operations. The practical choice was accepting personnel whose loyalties were uncertain or withdrawing from territories entirely. Supply diversion was endemic. Trucks carrying food aid traveled through territories controlled by different armed groups, each demanding portions as transit fees. Warehouses storing supplies were vulnerable to seizure when security situations deteriorated. Distribution points were infiltrated by combatants who received aid alongside civilian populations. Tracking where specific supplies ended up was impossible. In fluid conflict environments where monitoring visits were too dangerous, and implementing partners' information was unreliable. Afghanistan provided the longest-running case study. Over 2 decades of operations, USAID spent billions on agricultural development, fertilizer, irrigation equipment, improved seeds, technical assistance. The programs achieved documented increases in agricultural productivity. They also supported unprecedented poppy cultivation and heroin production that generated revenues substantially benefiting the Taliban. The connection was structural rather than incidental. Fertilizer provided for wheat cultivation worked equally well for poppies. Irrigation systems that increased food production also increased opium yields. Agricultural extension services that taught modern farming techniques included knowledge applicable to poppy cultivation. The assistance genuinely improved Afghan agriculture while inadvertently supporting the primary revenue source for insurgent groups the U.S. military was combating. I remember the assessments documenting this dynamic and how they struggled with attribution. Was USAID directly funding poppy cultivation? No programs explicitly prohibited support for narcotics production. Were programs indirectly enabling increased opium production? Demonstrably, yes, the same inputs and infrastructure that supported licit agriculture also supported illicit cultivation. Should this indirect effect be considered diversion requiring program termination? The strategic calculus suggested no withdrawing agricultural assistance would create humanitarian crises and eliminate American influence in rural areas where Taliban were strongest. The numbers were staggering. Estimates suggested hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. assistance indirectly supported narcotics production. Afghanistan produced more than 90% of global opium supply during the peak years of American presence. The Taliban derived substantial revenue from taxing poppy cultivation and opium trade. American agricultural assistance didn't cause the narcotics. Trad Afghans had cultivated poppies, for centuries, but it certainly supported agricultural capacity that enabled unprecedented production levels. The pattern repeated across conflict zones in Pakistan. Assistance meant to strengthen governance in tribal areas flowed to regions where Taliban and Al-Qaeda maintained presence. Development projects employed local laborers who included insurgent fighters. Infrastructure built with USAID funding was used by groups combating American interests. Each case involved the same calculation maintaining presence, despite diversion risk versus withdrawing and ceding influence entirely. The Inspector General's investigations documented not just that diversion occurred, but that it was known, anticipated, and accepted as operational cost. Risk assessments warned about diversion possibilities before programs began. Monitoring reports documented diversions during implementation. Post-program evaluations confirmed that substantial assistance reached adversarial groups. Yet programs continued because the strategic imperative to maintain presence outweighed the cost of captured resources. I remember the legal framework that made these operations sustainable and recognizing how it enabled systematic diversion while maintaining official deniability. Federal law prohibited material support to designated terrorist organizations. But USAID programs didn't provide direct support. They funded implementing partners who operated in territories where designated groups exercised control. The layers of contractual separation meant USAID couldn't be charged with directly supporting terrorists, even when assistance predictably reached them. The implementing partners faced different legal exposure. International NGOs argued they operated under humanitarian principles, requiring neutrality and impartiality. They provided assistance to populations in need, regardless of who controlled territory. This humanitarian exemption created legal cover for operations that involved inevitable cooperation with groups the U.S. government designated as terrorists. The organizations weren't supporting terrorism. They were providing humanitarian assistance that happened to occur in terrorist-controlled areas. Local subcontractors operated under even less legal constraint. They weren't bound by U.S. law prohibiting material support to terrorists. They operated under local law in jurisdictions where groups Americans called terrorists were often legitimate political actors or even governing authorities. The legal and political context in which they operated was completely different from American frameworks, creating space where activities that would be criminal if conducted by Americans were normal business practice for local organizations. This legal architecture enabled what the Inspector General would later identify as a structural loophole. USAID itself couldn't provide material support to terrorists, but its contractors faced no such prohibition in their grant agreements. The absence of counterterrorism financing requirements in contractor agreements meant money could flow to designated groups without technically violating the terms governing the relationship between USAID and its implementing partners. The implications extended beyond humanitarian assistance to USAID's utility for covert operations. If aid could flow to territories controlled by designated terrorist groups under humanitarian cover, the same mechanisms could intentionally fund groups that served American strategic interests, even when those groups engaged in activities that would be problematic if American sponsorship were acknowledged. The architecture of plausible deniability protected both unintended diversion to adversaries and intended support for proxy forces operating under similar legal ambiguity. I remembered the testimony when senators demanded explanations for documented diversions and how USAID officials responded. The explanations emphasized impossible choices that operating in conflict zones required accepting diversion risk, that the alternative was abandoning populations to humanitarian catastrophe, that maintaining American presence justified costs, including captured resources. These arguments were simultaneously honest and misleading. Honest about operational realities, misleading about whether humanitarian mission or strategic presence was the actual priority. The diversions served strategic purposes even when they supported adversaries. Aid flows into contested territories required negotiations with local power structures, including armed groups, creating intelligence, opportunities, and relationships that could be leveraged for purposes beyond humanitarian assistance. Organizations operating in conflict zones developed information about armed group capabilities, leadership structures, and intentions that was valuable to intelligence services. Personnel who coordinated aid delivery with terrorist-controlled areas provided cover for intelligence collection that couldn't occur through official channels. The captured resources were losses, but not total losses. They kept populations fed enough to remain in territories rather than flee as refugees. They created dependencies that could be exploited when strategic circumstances changed. And they demonstrated American commitment to populations in ways that generated influence even when adversarial groups captured portions of assistance. The strategic accounting was complex, measuring costs against benefits that weren't captured in program evaluations focused on development outcomes. The pattern revealed USAID's dual mandate operating in its starkest form. As development agency, aid diversion represented program failure, resources not reaching intent. I remember when critics compiled a list, a catalog of USAID expenditures that seemed designed to generate maximum political controversy. $1.5 million for diversity, equity, and inclusion in Serbia's workplaces, $70,000 for a day musical in Ireland, $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia, millions for LGBT activism in Guatemala, funding to EcoHealth Alliance for research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology that would become central to debates about COVID-19's origins. Each expenditure was documented in grant databases, described in program summaries, and defensible through development frameworks that emphasized human rights, inclusive governance, and public health research. Each also fueled narratives that USAID had been captured by narrow political interests, that mission creep had transformed strategic development priorities into ideological pet projects, reflecting donor country politics rather than recipient country needs. The Serbia Workplace Diversity Program illustrated the pattern. USAID funding supported training initiatives teaching Serbian companies about diversity, equity, and inclusion principles. The program description emphasized economic benefits of inclusive workplaces, alignment with European Union standards Serbia needed to meet for accession negotiations, and strengthening of democratic values through respect for minority rights. Critics saw something different. American taxpayers' funding programs that imposed progressive social values on conservative societies. Development assistance serving as vehicle for cultural imperialism. Strategic resources diverted to projects that advanced ideological agendas rather than addressing poverty. Health or economic development that constituted USAID's core mandate. The Ireland musical funding was particularly inflammatory. Ireland was a wealthy, developed nation with per capita GDP exceeding the United States. Yet USAID funded a musical production about diversity, equity, and inclusion themes. The justification involved Northern Ireland peace process initiatives and cross-border cooperation. But the optics were terrible American aid, money funding theatrical productions in rich countries, while humanitarian needs went unmet in impoverished regions. I remember the Columbia Transgender Opera Grant and how it encapsulated the debate about USAID's proper role. The program supported artistic expression, exploring gender identity issues in Colombian society. Proponents argued that supporting LGBTQ rights was legitimate human rights work, that artistic expression was valid development programming, and that marginalized communities deserved assistance regardless of whether their issues aligned with traditional development metrics. Opponents saw taxpayer funds supporting controversial social agendas in foreign countries, programs that generated backlash against American presence by associating it with values many Colombians rejected, and resources diverted from concrete development needs clean water, healthcare, education toward cultural programming that serve donor country, political priorities rather than recipient country development requirements. The Guatemala LGBT activism funding was more substantial millions of dollars, supporting organizations advocating for expanded rights, legal protections, and social acceptance. The programs operated in a country where significant portions of the population opposed these changes on religious and cultural grounds. USAID funding didn't just support marginalized communities. It funded political advocacy, challenging established social norms and religious teachings that were central to Guatemalan culture. This raised fundamental questions about development assistance and sovereignty. Did USAID have the right to fund advocacy that sought to change recipient countries' laws and social norms? Was supporting human rights universal, or was it imposing donor country values on societies with different cultural frameworks? Where was the line between legitimate democracy promotion and illegitimate cultural imperialism? The answers depended on whether you viewed human rights as universal principles or as culturally constructed values. If rights were universal, then supporting LGBT advocacy was defending human dignity, regardless of local cultural opposition. If rights were culturally constructed, then using development assistance to advance controversial social agendas was imperialism, regardless of good intentions. USAID's position was consistently universalist, that human rights existed independent of cultural context, that development agencies had obligation to support marginalized groups, even when this generated political controversy, that sovereignty couldn't justify oppression. This position was philosophically defensible but politically problematic when it meant American assistance funded advocacy that recipient country governments and populations viewed as hostile to their values. I remember examining the EcoHealth Alliance funding and recognizing how it illustrated different dimensions of mission creep. The grants supported coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, work described as crucial for pandemic preparedness and emerging disease detection. The scientific rationale was sound understanding how coronaviruses jumped from animal populations to humans. Required research in regions where these spillovers occurred. But when COVID-19 emerged from Wuhan, the funding became politically explosive. Had American assistance supported research that created the pandemic, Even if research hadn't directly caused COVID-19, should USAID have been funding work at Chinese laboratories where biosafety standards were questionable? Did the grants serve development objectives, or were they supporting scientific research that could have been funded through health agencies without linking it to development assistance? The controversy revealed how USAID's broad mandate created opportunities for virtually any program to be justified through development frameworks. Scientific research supported pandemic preparedness, cultural programs supported social cohesion. LGBT advocacy supported human rights and democratic governance. Each program connected to development theory while serving purposes that seemed distant from traditional poverty alleviation, health improvement, or economic growth that constituted development assistance's historical core. The pattern suggested what critics called ideological capture, that USAID had been infiltrated by activists who used development budgets to advance progressive social agendas, that career staff substituted their political preferences for recipient country priorities, that the agency's leadership lacked political will to resist mission creep because they sympathized with the ideological objectives being pursued. The alternative explanation was strategic, that these programs served American interests by promoting values aligned with U.S. foreign policy, that supporting LGBT rights in Guatemala advanced broader democratization objectives, that funding date programs in Serbia supported European integration that served American strategic interests, that the programs reflected deliberate policy rather than rogue activism by captured bureaucrats. Both explanations likely contained truth. Some programs probably reflected staff members' genuine belief that development assistance should support progressive social values regardless of recipient country priorities. Other programs probably served strategic purposes using social issues to build civil society networks, creating divisions that could be exploited politically, demonstrating American commitment to values that differentiated it from authoritarian competitors like China and Russia. I remember the appropriations language that should have constrained controversial spending and recognizing how it was navigated through program design. Congress regularly included provisions prohibiting funds from being used for abortion advocacy, restricting support for organizations engaged in coercive population control, and limiting assistance that could be perceived as undermining religious freedom. But these restrictions applied to specific prohibited activities, not to broader programs that included them as components of larger initiatives. A program nominally focused on women's health could include reproductive rights advocacy without violating abortion restrictions, as long as abortion advocacy wasn't the primary purpose. An LGBT rights initiative could operate as democracy and governance programming rather than as social advocacy. Cultural programs could support controversial, artistic expression as long as they were framed as supporting freedom of expression rather than promoting specific ideological content. The grants were structured to survive congressional scrutiny. Program descriptions emphasized development objectives that were uncontroversial: inclusive economic growth, democratic governance, civil society strengthening. The controversial elements were buried in implementation plans, sub-grant agreements, and program activities that weren't visible in high-level documentation that Congress reviewed during appropriations processes. This created accountability gap. Members of Congress who might have opposed specific grants often didn't know they existed until critics discovered them in USAID funding databases or through investigative reporting. By the time controversies emerged, programs were often completed or substantially implemented. Oversight occurred retroactively rather than preventively, documenting problems without preventing them. The political costs were substantial. Each controversial grant became ammunition for critics arguing that USAID had lost focus, that development assistance was being wasted on frivolous projects, that the agency prioritized progressive social engineering over pragmatic development outcomes. The cumulative effect undermined support for foreign assistance generally, making appropriations battles more difficult even for programs that had nothing to do with the controversial expenditures. The credibility costs extended to recipient countries. Governments that viewed LGBT advocacy as Western imperialism became less cooperative with USAID programming generally. Populations that associated American assistance with controversial social values became more susceptible to anti-American messaging from competitors. Religious leaders who opposed USAID-funded advocacy mobilized their followers against American presence. Each controversy created political capital for adversaries who portrayed American assistance as Trojan horse for cultural subversion rather than genuine development support. I remember examining whether these programs actually achieved their stated objectives and finding mixed evidence. Some LGBT advocacy did strengthen legal protections in target countries. Some diversity in training did improve workplace practices. Some cultural programming did challenge discriminatory attitudes. But the backlash often exceeded the progress-generating political reactions that made further advancement more difficult, associating progressive values with foreign interference rather than indigenous evolution, and creating martyr narratives for conservative movements opposing the changes USAID sought to promote. The strategic calculation was difficult to assess. If programs generated backlash that strengthened anti-American political movements, they failed even if they achieved nominal program objectives. If they built civil society networks that could be mobilized for broader political purposes, they succeeded even if they failed to achieve lasting social change. The dual mandate meant programs could be evaluated against development objectives or strategic objectives, with success on one dimension potentially coexisting with failure on the other. The fundamental question was whether these programs served recipient country interests or donor country interests. Proponents argued they served universal human interests by supporting marginalized groups and advancing rights, regardless of political opposition. Critics argued they served narrow ideological interests of American political factions who used development assistance to export their domestic political agenda globally. The truth likely varied by program. Some initiatives probably reflected genuine commitment to human rights and beliefs that development agencies should support marginalized groups. Others probably served strategic purposes, building activist networks that could mobilize for political objectives beyond the nominal program focus, demonstrating American values in ways that differentiated it from competitors, creating divisions in target societies that could be exploited for strategic advantage. What united the controversial programs was that they generated political costs that exceeded their strategic benefits. The Serbia Day program wasn't worth the ammunition it provided to critics questioning USAID's mission. The Ireland musical wasn't worth the credibility damage from funding theatrical productions in wealthy countries. The controversies created political vulnerabilities that made the agencies. I remember when the fundamental conflict became unavoidable in congressional testimony and leaked. Internal assessments at USAID's mandate to strengthen democracy and good governance inherently involved promoting political change. The agency couldn't simultaneously claim political neutrality and pursue programs designed to reshape how recipient countries selected leaders, administered justice, and organized civil society participation. Programs introducing judicial independence actively reduced executive control over courts. Initiatives strengthening legislative oversight constrained presidential authority. Civil society development empowered organizations to challenge government policies. Each program, however technically framed, redistributed political power from existing holders toward alternative actors. This was the point governance reform meant, changing who held power and how they exercised it. The question wasn't whether USAID was political. Any agency promoting good governance and democratic institutions was inherently political, because these concepts embodied contested values about legitimate authority, individual rights, and state-society relationships. The question was, whose political model USAID exported, and whether that model served recipient countries' genuine development needs or primarily advanced American strategic interests while claiming universal validity. The American model emphasized specific institutional forms, independent judiciaries, competitive multi-party elections, robust civil society organizations, free press, civilian control of military forces, decentralized governance structures, protection of minority rights, and market-oriented economic policies. USAID programs consistently promoted these institutional arrangements, described as necessary for democratic governance regardless of local contexts or cultural traditions. But these arrangements reflected particular historical experiences and philosophical commitments that weren't necessarily universal. Other democratic traditions emphasized different values: collective decision-making over individual rights, consensus building over competitive elections, social harmony over contentious pluralism, state coordination over market mechanisms. Whether American institutional forms represented superior democratic models or simply different ones was philosophically contested. I remember examining program designs and recognizing how they presumed American institutional superiority. Judicial reform programs introduced adversarial legal procedures modeled on American practice rather than inquisitorial systems prevalent in civil law countries. Legislative strengthening programs emphasized American-style committee structures and oversight mechanisms. Civil society programs supported advocacy organizations operating through confrontational tactics rather than traditional community structures emphasizing consensus. The programs weren't presented as promoting American models specifically. They were framed as supporting universal democratic principles, strengthening institutional capacity, improving governance effectiveness. But the specific institutional forms consistently aligned with American practice, and the metrics measuring success reflected American assumptions about what effective democratic governance required. This created tension with sovereignty that USAID's rhetoric acknowledged, while its operations violated. Program documents emphasized country ownership and locally led development principles, suggesting that recipient countries control priorities and implementation, but the reality was different. USAID defined program objectives, selected implementing partners, approved work plans, and evaluated outcomes based on progress toward goals that reflected American preferences rather than recipient government priorities. when recipient governments opposed programs viewing judicial independence initiatives as undermining sovereign authority, civil society funding as supporting political opposition, governance reforms as imposing foreign models, cite typically continued operations through civil society organizations rather than government channels. This maintained program implementation while demonstrating that country ownership meant ownership by actors USAID selected, not by legitimately constituted governments when those governments disagreed with American priorities. The pattern was most visible in countries viewed as geopolitical rivals or adversaries. In Russia, USAID funded civil society organizations that opposed Putin's government, supported independent media that criticized Kremlin policies, and strengthened opposition political movements. The programs were described as democracy promotion, but Russian officials reasonably viewed them as interference designed to weaken the government and potentially facilitate regime change. In Venezuela, similar programs supported opposition to Maduro's government funding civil society organizations that mobilized protests, supporting media outlets that challenged official narratives, strengthening networks that coordinated resistance. Whether these programs defended democracy against authoritarianism or interfered with a sovereign nation's political processes depended on whether you accepted American assessments of which governments were legitimate and which were illegitimate. In China, USAID's limited operations focused on supporting civil society in Hong Kong and Tibet regions, where opposition to Beijing's authority served American strategic interests. Programs supporting democratic governance in these contexts inherently challenged Chinese sovereignty and were understood by Beijing as hostile operations regardless of humanitarian rhetoric. I remember the criticism that staff used diplomatic cover to provoke political change, not aligned with U.S. national security, but rather with internal institutional biases, that USAID had been captured by personnel whose political commitments shaped operations in ways that sometimes conflicted with strategic objectives. The critique identified legitimate tension between development professionals' values and strategic requirements. Development professionals were disproportionately drawn from populations committed to progressive values, international cooperation, and belief in universal human rights. These commitments were assets for development work. They motivated personnel to serve in difficult environments, sustained commitment through challenging conditions, and ensured genuine belief in programs' humanitarian purposes. But they also created potential for operations shaped more by staff values than by strategic calculations. The question was whether programs supporting LGBT rights in socially conservative countries served American strategic interests or reflected staff members' personal commitments to these values, whether funding feminist organizations in traditional societies advanced strategic objectives or represented ideological preferences, whether democracy promotion in countries where political Islam might gain power through democratic processes served American interests or reflected secular staff members' discomfort with religious governance. These tensions were real, but probably overstated by critics. USAID's leadership came from political appointments reflecting administration priorities. Program budgets required approval from officials accountable to elected representatives. Congressional oversight, however imperfect, provided mechanisms for correcting operations that diverged too far from policy guidance. The idea that career staff captured the agency and pursued rogue operations contradicted organizational realities where political leadership controlled resources and career staff implemented approved programs. The more fundamental issue was that democracy promotion itself was inherently political in ways that couldn't be resolved through better management or clearer strategic guidance. Supporting civil society meant empowering actors to challenge governments. Strengthening independent media meant enabling criticism of authorities. Promoting judicial independence meant reducing executive control. These activities were political interventions, regardless of whether they served strategic objectives, reflected staff biases, or genuinely advanced democratic governance. I remember the distinction critics drew between security-lined and ideologically driven operations, suggesting that some programs served clear national security objectives, while others reflected internal institutional preferences disconnected from strategic requirements. The distinction had analytical value but was difficult to apply in practice, because programs typically served multiple purposes simultaneously. Supporting civil society in Russia weakened Putin's government's strategic objective while also reflecting genuine commitment to human rights and democratic values. Institutional preference. LGBT advocacy in Guatemala challenged conservative governments aligned with China's strategic objective while also expressing sincere belief in universal rights ideological commitment. The programs weren't purely strategic or purely ideological, they were both, with different actors emphasizing different justifications depending on which audience they addressed. The Zunzunio operation in Cuba, which we'll examine in detail shortly, illustrated this complexity. Was it strategic operation designed to destabilize Castro's government and potentially trigger regime change? Or was it ideologically driven intervention reflecting belief that Cubans deserved freedom regardless of strategic calculations? The answer was probably both, that strategic objectives and genuine democratic commitments reinforced each other, making operations simultaneously pragmatic and principled depending on perspective. The staff orientation issue revealed deeper tension about whether American democracy promotion was defensive or offensive, whether programs protected, threatened democratic institutions, or actively destabilized governments. Washington opposed. USAID's rhetoric consistently emphasized the defensive frame, supporting civil society defending itself against authoritarian encroachment, strengthening independent institutions resisting executive overreach, protecting vulnerable populations from oppressive governments. But operations often look defensive from recipient countries' perspectives. Funding opposition movements, supporting protest mobilization, strengthening networks, coordinating resistance to established governments. The same activities could be characterized as defending democracy or destabilizing sovereignty, depending on whether you accepted American assessments of which governments were legitimate democratic actors and which were authoritarian threats. This ambiguity was strategic rather than accidental. Programs maintaining dual interpretations simultaneously, defensible as democracy support and functional as political warfare, provided flexibility and deniability that purely covert operations lacked. They challenged. USAID could point to genuine democracy promotion activities or denying strategic objectives that were equally real but less publicly defensible. I remember examining the philosophical foundation and recognizing it traced two arguments. Kennan had made in 1948 that defending democratic values sometimes required using methods that appeared to contradict those values. that political warfare was defensive response to adversarial operations rather than aggressive interference. That temporary moral compromises were justified by larger objective of preserving freedom against totalitarian threats. These arguments legitimized operations that would be difficult to defend through straightforward democratic principles. Funding civil society to challenge elected governments contradicted sovereignty norms. Supporting media to criticize foreign leaders violated non-interference principles. Strengthening opposition movements interfered with legitimate political processes. But if these activities defended democracy against authoritarian threats, the contradictions were acceptable tactical compromises rather than fundamental violations of democratic values. The problem was that authoritarian threat was defined by American assessments that often reflected strategic interests rather than objective institutional analysis. Governments that challenged American interests were characterized as authoritarian regardless of how they came to power or how they governed. Governments that supported American interests were characterized as democratic despite obvious violations of democratic norms. The selectivity undermined claims that democracy promotion reflected universal principles rather than strategic preferences. Venezuela illustrated the pattern. Maduro's government had serious democratic deficits, restrictions on opposition, manipulation of electoral processes, suppression of dissent, but opposition movements that USAID supported also violated democratic norms, refusing to accept electoral defeats, coordinating with foreign powers to undermine government, attempting extra-constitutional removal of elected president. Whether USAID supported democracy or supported preferred faction was ambiguous, with selection based partly on democratic credentials but substantial. I remember when the operation was exposed in April 2014 through Associated Press investigative reporting documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and interviews with participants revealed what USAID had constructed in Cuba over 3 years. The agency's contractors had created a Twitter-like social network called Zunzunio, Cuban slang for hummingbirds tweet, and marketed it to Cuban users as an independent platform created by a Spanish entrepreneur interested in connecting young Cubans through mobile messaging. Every element of that story was false. The funding came from USAID, concealed through appropriations designated for Pakistan, a country thousands of miles from Cuba, with no operational connection to the program. The congressional notification process that should have informed relevant committees about operations in Cuba was circumvented by classifying the spending under Pakistani humanitarian assistance. This was an accounting error or bureaucratic confusion, was deliberate concealment designed to hide the operation's existence from oversight mechanisms that would have questioned using development funds for covert political operations in Cuba. Creative Associates International, a frequent USAID contractor with experience implementing programs in conflict zones and transitional countries, managed the operation. The company had received more than $100 million in USAID contracts over its history, implementing education programs, democracy initiatives, and conflict mitigation projects across dozens of countries. Its selection for Zunzunio reflected proven capacity to manage complex operations requiring discretion. Creative Associates established what AP described as a Byzantine system of front companies using Cayman Islands bank accounts to obscure the money trail. The corporate structure was designed to resist forensic analysis, shell companies incorporated in offshore jurisdictions with opaque beneficial ownership requirements, bank accounts that could receive and disperse funds without triggering reporting requirements that would reveal U.S. government connections, contractual relationships sufficiently complex that investigators would struggle to trace them back to USAID. The operation recruited business executives to serve as public faces, individuals who weren't told about U.S. government involvement. These cutouts provided additional deniability. Questioned, they could honestly claim they didn't work for the American government because they genuinely didn't know the program's actual sponsorship. The deception extended to the hired personnel themselves, creating layers of separation where people operating the platform didn't understand who actually controlled and funded it. I remember the technical implementation and recognizing its sophistication. Zunzunyo launched in 2010, operating through Cuban mobile networks by exploiting a gap in the country's telecommunications infrastructure. Cuban users could send and receive text messages internationally at relatively low cost, creating opportunity for social network operating through SMS rather than internet connectivity that the Cuban government more tightly controlled. The platform initially offered non-controversial content, carefully designed to attract users without triggering government suspicion. Sports scores, entertainment news, hurricane alerts, cultural information content that Cuban youth wanted, and that appeared genuinely useful rather than politically motivated. This was the lure phase of what intelligence professionals would recognize as classic influence operation methodology. Establish trust through valuable service before introducing content designed to shape political attitudes. The subscriber base grew rapidly, reaching 40,000 users by 2012. The platform's popularity reflected genuine demand for social connectivity in a country where internet access was severely restricted and state media dominated information spaces. Users spread word about Zunzunyo organically, each recruit bringing friends and family onto the platform. The growth was authentic, even though the platform itself was government-funded operation maintaining false identity. As the user base expanded, the operation moved toward its actual objectives. USAID contractors developed plans to introduce political messaging, starting with content that was subtly critical of government, gradually escalating toward explicitly political material. The strategy documents described intentions to use the platform to inspire a Cuban Spring mass. Mobilizations modeled on Arab Spring uprisings that had toppled governments in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya in 2011. The Arab Spring analogy was explicit in planning documents. Contractors studied how social media had been used to coordinate protests in Tahrir Square and Tunis, how viral messaging had overwhelmed state media narratives, how networks of youth activists had mobilized populations faster than security services could respond. The goal was replicating these dynamics in Cuba, using Zunzunyo to coordinate mass gatherings that might renegotiate the balance of power between state and society. That phrase, renegotiate the balance of power, appeared in program documents as euphemism for regime change. The operation wasn't designed to reform Castro's government or encourage gradual democratic opening. It was designed to destabilize the government through mass mobilization that would either force political concessions or create conditions for government collapse. I remembered the surveillance dimension and how it revealed purposes beyond social networking. Zunzunyo wasn't just connecting Cuban youth, it was building a database of their demographics, social connections, and political tendencies. Every message sent through the platform was collected. User interactions were mapped to identify influential nodes in social networks. Content was analyzed to assess political attitudes and identify users who might be receptive to opposition messaging. This data collection created intelligence asset with strategic value independent of whether the platform succeeded in inspiring protests. The database identified potential recruits for future operations, mapped social networks that could be activated when circumstances were favorable, and provided insights into Cuban society that would have been difficult to gather through traditional intelligence collection. The operation generated intelligence while maintaining cover as social media platform. When Zunzunio reached approximately 60,000 subscribers in 2012, representing a substantial portion of Cuba's youth with mobile phone access, the operation faced a crisis. The contractors couldn't sustain funding through mechanisms that had been used initially. The platform required ongoing operational costs, server maintenance, telecommunications fees, personnel managing content. Without continued funding, it would collapse, exposing the operation and potentially endangering users who might face government retaliation for participating in American intelligence operation. USAID attempted to find external funding that would allow the platform to continue while separating it from visible governance support. Proposals were developed to approach private companies or foundations that might sustain Zunzunio as commercial venture. But these efforts failed. No private entity wanted to assume legal and political risks of operating a social network in Cuba that was actually a disguised U.S. government operation. The platform was terminated in 2012, disappearing without explanation to users who had been told it was independent commercial service. Tens of thousands of Cubans who had trusted the platform shared personal information and potentially expressed political views they believed were private, suddenly lost access. They weren't informed that the service they'd used was actually a U.S. government operation. They were simply abandoned when the operation became unsustainable. The exposure in 2014 generated political controversy along predictable lines. Critics argued that USAID had conducted covert operation that endangered Cuban users, violated development assistance's humanitarian purpose, and represented illegal covert action conducted without required presidential findings or congressional notification. The operation appeared to violate laws requiring CIA authorization for covert political warfare and congressional oversight of intelligence activities. USAID's defense emphasized that Zunzunio wasn't covert action under legal definitions that apply to intelligence operations. It was discrete democracy promotion. Conducted under USAID's development mandate, the distinction was semantic rather than substantive. The operation was designed to destabilize a foreign government through covert means, exactly fitting the definition of political warfare that NSC 10 halves had established. But by routing it through USAID rather than CIA, the operation avoided legal requirements that would have applied to intelligence activities. I remember the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's attempted oversight and how it revealed USAID's advantages over intelligence agencies for conducting politically sensitive operations. Committee staffers tried to investigate Zunzunio after its exposure, seeking to understand how the operation had been designed, who had authorized it, what oversight had occurred, and whether it violated prohibitions on using development funds for intelligence operations. They hit a wall. USAID invoked operational security, claiming that disclosure would endanger lives of people who had worked on the operation or Cubans who had used the platform. The agency refused to provide detailed briefings, declined to share operational documents, and resisted congressional attempts to examine decision-making processes that had authorized the operation. The testimony was revealing. Senate staffers stated they had no visibility on this entire operation the entire time, because USAID successfully claimed that lives were at stake. The Foreign Relations Committee, which had an explicit oversight mandate for State Department and USAID operations, was kept completely ignorant of an operation that spent development funds on covert political warfare designed to destabilize a foreign government. This demonstrated USAID's critical structural advantage. CIA operations required presidential findings that put the operation on record with oversight committees. Intelligence activities were subject to reporting requirements that informed congressional leadership even when details were classified. But USAID operations falling under discrete democracy promotion avoided these requirements. No presidential finding was needed. No intelligence committee notification was required. The operation could proceed with minimal oversight, and when Congress attempted investigation after exposure, USAID could invoke operational security to prevent meaningful accountability. The legal framework created perverse incentives. Operations that were too dirty for the CIA, too controversial, too legally questionable, too politically explosive could be routed through USAID under developmental cover. If an operation would struggle to receive CIA authorization because its risks or methods were problematic, it could be reframed as democracy promotion and implemented through USAID without triggering oversight mechanisms that would have questioned it. I remember the Cuban government's response and recognizing that Zunzunio vindicated their long-standing claims about USAID operations. Cuban officials had consistently characterized American development programs as cover for subversive activities designed to undermine the government. These claims had been dismissed by U.S. officials as paranoid propaganda. Zunzunio proved them accurate. The operation confirmed that USAID conducted covert political warfare under humanitarian cover, that democracy promotion rhetoric concealed destabilization objectives, and that development programs in Cuba were actually intelligence operations maintaining false identities. Cuban security services' suspicions about American aid programs weren't paranoid. They were appropriate caution about operations that were exactly what they suspected. The exposure damaged USAID's credibility globally. If the agency created fake social networks in Cuba, what else was it doing under developmental cover? Aid programs in other countries faced increased scrutiny from governments wondering whether USAID presence concealed covert operations. NGOs implementing USAID-funded programs faced heightened security service attention. Personnel faced elevated risks because foreign governments reasonably viewed them as potential intelligence operatives, regardless of their actual roles. The operation also revealed strategic short-sightedness. Even if Zunzunio had succeeded in inspiring protests, the likely outcome wasn't Cuban Spring leading to democratic transition. It was violent crackdown, strengthened security apparatus, and increased repression justified by proven American interference. The Arab Spring analogy ignored that most of those uprisings had led not to stable democracies but to civil war, military coup, or sustained instability that created humanitarian catastrophes. The plan suggested either stunning naivete about regime change dynamics or cynical willingness to destabilize Cuba regardless of consequences for Cuban people. Either possibility raised questions about USAID's competence or ethics in conducting operations that risked Cuban lives to serve American strategic interests while claiming humanitarian purposes. I remember examining the operation's relationship to earlier covert programs in Cuba and recognizing Zunzunio as a continuation of decades-long effort to undermine Castro's government through methods that evolved with technology. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Operation Mongoose sabotage campaigns, support for exile groups conducting attacks, propaganda broadcasting American efforts to destabilize Cuba had operated continuously since the revolution, adapting tactics while maintaining consistent objective of regime change. Zunzunio represented updated methodology for digital age, but the fundamental approach was unchanged. Create infrastructure that appeared independent. Attract Cuban participation through valuable services. Build networks that could be activated for political purposes. Maintain plausible deniability about U.S. sponsorship until operations were exposed. The tactics evolved from radio broadcasting to social media, but the strategic logic persisted across 60 years of continuous operations. The operation's classification as democracy. Promotion rather than covert action was legally significant, but operationally meaningless. Zunzunio was designed to destabilize a foreign government through covert means textbook definition of political warfare. The semantic distinction that made it USAID's responsibility rather than CIA. I remember when Senate Foreign Relations Committee staffers attempted comprehensive oversight of Zunzunio and discovered that their constitutional authority meant nothing against USAID's invocation of operational security. The committee had explicit mandate to oversee State Department and USAID operations. Its jurisdiction over foreign assistance was unambiguous, established by decades of precedent and codified in Senate rules. Yet when staffers sought to understand how a covert social media operation had been funded through development appropriations, they were systematically stonewalled. The initial requests were straightforward. Provide briefings on the operations authorization, explain the decision-making process, share documentation about program design and implementation, account for how congressional notification requirements were satisfied. These weren't unusual demands. Congressional oversights of executive branch operations routinely involved access to sensitive information. With appropriate security clearances and closed-door briefings protecting classified details while enabling accountability, USAID's response was to claim that disclosure would endanger lives. Personnel who had worked on the operation faced potential retaliation from Cuban intelligence services. Cubans who had used the platform might be identified and prosecuted if operational details were revealed. The contractors and subcontractors who had implemented the program needed protection from exposure that could compromise their ability to work in hostile environments. Each claim had superficial plausibility while functioning as comprehensive shield against meaningful oversight. The lives at stake justification was particularly effective because it was impossible to definitively refute. Committee staffers couldn't prove that disclosure wouldn't endanger anyone. They couldn't guarantee that Cuban intelligence wouldn't use information from congressional briefings to identify and punish participants. The possibility of harm, however remote, created political risk that made aggressive oversight appear reckless. But the justification also created perverse incentive structure. If claiming that lives were at stake prevented oversight, then every controversial operation could invoke the same protection. the more problematic an operation was, the more important it became to prevent congressional examination, and the easier it was to claim that exposure would endanger people. The mechanism transformed oversight from constitutional function into optional executive branch courtesy, granted when convenient and withheld when accountability might prove embarrassing. I remember the legal framework that should have prevented this obstruction, and recognizing how it had been systematically undermined. The Foreign Assistance Act required congressional notification for programs in certain countries and above certain funding thresholds. The National Security Act required presidential findings for covert action and notification to intelligence committees. Together, these requirements created architecture where significant operations couldn't proceed without congressional awareness. Zunzunio evaded these requirements through careful program design. The operation was funded through Pakistani appropriations, avoiding notification requirements triggered by Cuba's Pacific spending. It was classified as democracy promotion rather than covert action, placing it under USAID's development mandate rather than CIA's intelligence authority. The funding was distributed across multiple years and contracts, keeping individual expenditures below thresholds that would trigger enhanced reporting requirements. Each evasion was technically legal or at least defensible through creative legal interpretation, but collectively they demonstrated intentional effort to hide the operation from congressional oversight. The program design wasn't shaped by operational requirements, but by legal architecture, structured to avoid triggering reporting obligations, while achieving objectives that couldn't survive transparent evaluation. The Senate testimony after the scandal was damning in its implications. Staffers acknowledged they had no visibility on this entire operation the entire time, despite the Foreign Relations Committee's oversight mandate. The operation had proceeded for 3 years, spent millions of dollars, recruited tens of thousands of Cuban users, and built intelligence database without the committee responsible for overseeing such activities knowing it existed. This wasn't oversight failure in the sense of inadequate attention or insufficient resources. The committee hadn't missed signs of problematic operations. USAID had successfully concealed the operation's existence from the oversight process entirely, ensuring that the committee never had opportunity to question it. The failure was systemic, revealing that congressional oversight mechanisms were insufficient to detect operations that executive branch agencies were determined to hide. The distinction between USAID and CIA operations became critically important. When CIA conducted covert action, presidential findings were required. These findings were documented, reviewed by legal counsel, approved by the President, and reported to congressional intelligence committees. The process created record of the operation's authorization and ensured that at least some members of Congress were informed, even if details remained classified. But USAID operations, falling under discrete democracy promotion, required no presidential finding. They were authorized through normal program approval processes within USAID, requiring no White House involvement and generating no documentation that would flow to congressional oversight committees. The operations could be approved by mid-level officials without political appointees at cabinet level necessarily being informed, creating deniability that extended to the highest levels of government. I remember examining the advantages this created for politically sensitive operations and recognizing why Zunzunio was routed through USAI rather than CII. If proposed as CIA covert action, the operation would have required presidential finding that put it on record. The finding process would have involved National Security Council review, where officials might have questioned whether the operation's risks justified potential benefits. Intelligence Committee notification would have occurred, creating opportunity for congressional objections. These oversight mechanisms existed precisely to prevent reckless or illegal operations, to ensure that covert action received high-level review, that risks were carefully evaluated, that congressional leaders were positioned to object when operations violated law or policy. They represented decades of reforms enacted after scandals revealed that inadequate oversight had enabled operations that damaged American interests and violated democratic principles. But to officials seeking to conduct politically sensitive operations, these oversight mechanisms were obstacles rather than protections. They slowed operations by requiring review processes. They created political risk by informing additional people who might object or leak. They generated documentation that could be subpoenaed during investigations. From operational perspective, the oversight mechanisms were problems to be circumvented rather than constraints to be respected. USAID provided the circumvention mechanism. Operations that would be too dirty for the CIA to legally questionable, too politically controversial, too likely to generate congressional objections could be reframed as democracy promotion and routed through USAID's development authorities. No presidential finding was needed. No Intelligence Committee notification was required. The operation could proceed with approval from officials whose names would never appear in high-level policy documents. The phrase "too dirty for the CIA" appeared in critiques of Zunzunio and captured an important reality. Intelligence agencies, despite their reputation for operating in legal gray zones, faced constraints that USAID didn't. CIA lawyers reviewed operations for legal compliance. Intelligence committees exercised oversight that, while imperfect, created accountability. Presidential findings created records that could be examined during investigations. These constraints sometimes prevented operations that operational personnel believed were necessary but legally or politically problematic. USAID's looser oversight made it attractive for operations that couldn't survive. CIA's internal review or Congressional Intelligence Committee scrutiny. The agency could conduct political warfare using methods that intelligence lawyers might question, serving objectives that intelligence committees might oppose, with oversight limited to appropriations committees that reviewed budgets rather than operations, and that could be kept ignorant through creative accounting that concealed operational purposes. I remember the implications for democratic accountability and recognizing how Zunzunio revealed systematic erosion of constitutional oversight. The operation was an aberration. It was a logical outcome of incentive structures that rewarded evasion of oversight and provided mechanisms for conducting covert operations outside frameworks established to ensure accountability. The Senate's failed oversight attempt demonstrated that existing mechanisms were insufficient. Committee jurisdiction was meaningless if agencies could invoke operational security to prevent scrutiny. Reporting requirements were ineffective if operations could be structured to avoid triggering them. Congressional authority was theoretical rather than practical when executive branch agencies were determined to conceal controversial operations. The problem extended beyond USAID to broader challenges of overseeing national security operations in democratic systems. Effective oversight required information that executive branch controlled. It required expertise that congressional staff often lacked. It required sustained attention that was difficult to maintain given competing priorities. And it required political will to confront executive branch agencies that would characterize oversight as interference endangering national security. These challenges were inherent to democratic governance of intelligence and covert operations. They couldn't be solved through procedural reforms or additional reporting requirements. Any oversight mechanism could be circumvented by determined officials willing to structure operations to avoid triggering it. Any reporting requirement could be satisfied through creative compliance that provided information without enabling meaningful accountability. The Zunzuneo case suggested that the solution wasn't better oversight mechanisms, but rather restrictions on what operations could be conducted at all. If oversight couldn't prevent problematic operations, then operations like Zunzuneo should be prohibited rather than authorized subject to oversight that executive branch agencies could systematically evade. But this solution faced its own problems. Prohibiting USAID from conducting operations that might serve intelligence purposes would eliminate much of the agency's strategic utility. Development assistance that couldn't be leveraged for political warfare purposes would be less valuable to policymakers seeking tools short of military force. The prohibition would be difficult to enforce because distinguishing between legitimate democracy, promotion, and covert political warfare was often impossible even for program implementers. I remember the deep attention and recognizing it was fundamentally unresolvable. Democratic governance required congressional oversight of executive branch operations. Effective covert operations required secrecy that precluded transparent oversight. These requirements were in direct conflict, and no institutional arrangement could fully satisfy both. The balance had historically leaned toward oversight, with intelligence reforms in the 1970s, establishing frameworks that prioritized accountability over operational flexibility. But national security imperatives after 9/11s had shifted the balance toward operational freedom, with oversight increasingly characterized as obstacle rather than protection. Zunzuneo demonstrated how far the pendulum had swung. A major covert operation designed to destabilize a foreign government had been conducted for years without congressional knowledge. When exposed, the operation couldn't be investigated meaningfully because executive branch agencies successfully invoked operational security to prevent scrutiny. The constitutional oversight authority was theoretical rather than practical. The Senate staffers' testimony that they had no visibility on this entire operation should have generated reforms strengthening oversight. It should have prompted legislative action, clarifying that operational security couldn't be invoked to prevent congressional committees from receiving classified briefings. It should have resulted in restrictions on USAID's authority to conduct operations that looked like covert action, regardless of what they were called. But no significant reforms emerged. The scandal generated news coverage and political controversy, but didn't produce legislative changes that would prevent future operations from evading oversight through similar mechanisms. The incentive structures remained unchanged. The legal authorities that enabled Zunzuneo persisted, and the architecture that allowed operations. I remember when the Inspector General published a report 2 weeks before this script was written, revealing what had operated in shadows for 30 years, the February 2025 assessment. documented a structural feature that explained recurring scandals better than any theory about oversight failures or management incompetence. USAID cannot directly fund terrorist groups. Federal law prohibits material support to designated foreign terrorist organizations, creating clear legal barrier that the agency must respect. But USAID's contractors face no such prohibition in their grant agreements. The revelation appeared in bureaucratic language characteristic of Inspector General reports. Careful phrasing that documented problems without making accusations that would generate legal liability. But the implications were stark. For 3 decades, USAID had operated without requiring its implementing partners to comply with counterterrorism, financing restrictions that bound the agency itself. Contractors could move money to groups designated as terrorists without violating the grant terms that governed their relationships with USAID. This wasn't oversight gap or accidental omission. It was systematic absence of requirements that should have been obvious necessities. When banks conducted transactions involving designated terrorist organizations, they faced prosecution, massive fines, and potential loss of operating licenses. Financial institutions worldwide maintained elaborate compliance systems to ensure they didn't process payments connected to terrorism, understanding that violations would result in severe consequences. But USAID contractors operating in conflict zones, moving millions of dollars through regions where terrorist organizations exercised substantial control, faced no comparable requirements. Their grant agreements included provisions about financial reporting, audit compliance, and prohibition on fraud, but nothing explicitly preventing them from conducting transactions with designated terrorist organizations. The Inspector General's report documented this gap clinically, noting that USAID had not consistently included counterterrorism financing provisions in grants and cooperative agreements. The passive voice and qualified language obscured that this was deliberate policy rather than administrative oversight. USAID hadn't accidentally forgotten to include these provisions. The agency had systematically excluded them, creating what critics would characterize as a get-out-of-sponsoring terrorism-free card. I remember examining the operational logic and recognizing why this loophole existed. In conflict zones where USAID maintained strategic presence, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, Mali, Pakistan, terrorist organizations controlled territories, populations, and resources. Operating in these environments inevitably involved transactions that touched terrorist-controlled networks. Humanitarian aid required paying transit fees to armed groups controlling roads. Development projects required hiring local laborers who might be affiliated with designated organizations. Infrastructure programs required materials transported through territories where terrorist groups imposed taxes. Requiring contractors to strictly comply with counterterrorism, financing restrictions would make operations in these environments impossible or dramatically more expensive. Contractors would need elaborate vetting procedures, enhanced due diligence on every transaction, and legal reviews of supply chains. The administrative costs would be substantial. The operational delays would be significant, and many activities would simply become unfeasible because they couldn't be conducted without transactions involving designated groups. The alternative path USAID chose was creating contractual space where these transactions could occur without contractors violating their grant agreements. The agency couldn't directly fund terrorist groups without violating federal law, but contractors weren't bound by the same restrictions. creating separation that provided legal protection for USAID while enabling operations that required flexibility to conduct transactions that would be problematic if USAID's legal obligations applied throughout the implementation chain. This architecture explained patterns that had seemed like oversight failures. The $122 million that reached ISIS-affiliated groups in Syria was an accident. It was a predictable outcome of operations conducted by contractors who weren't required to prevent their funds from reaching designated terrorist organizations. The assistance flowing to terrorist networks in Pakistan and the Sahel was an evidence of inadequate. Monitoring it was inherent to operations implemented through contractors who could conduct transactions USAID itself couldn't legally conduct. The mechanism was sophisticated in its simplicity. USAID maintained legal compliance by not directly funding terrorists. Contractors maintained grant compliance by following terms that didn't prohibit transactions with terrorist groups. Each entity satisfied its legal obligations, while the overall system enabled funding flows that would be illegal if conducted through different arrangements. The separation created plausible deniability. USAID could claim it didn't fund terrorism because it only funded contractors, and contractors could claim they complied with grant terms that didn't address counterterrorism financing. I remembered the strategic utility in recognizing how this loophole enabled operations beyond humanitarian assistance in conflict zones. If contractors could move money to designated terrorist organizations without violating grant terms, the same mechanism could fund proxy forces, pay local militias, and support armed groups that served American interests, even when those groups engaged in activities that would be legally problematic if American sponsorship were acknowledged. Syria provided clear example. American policy involved supporting opposition forces against Assad's government while simultaneously combating ISIS. But opposition groups weren't clearly separated. Fighters moved between organizations. Territorial control shifted constantly, and groups that opposed Assad sometimes cooperated with groups designated as terrorists. In this environment, funding moderate opposition inevitably involved transactions with designated groups. Routing these operations through USAID contractors rather than CIA provided legal and political advantages. CIA support for Syrian opposition would constitute covert action requiring presidential findings and congressional notification. But USAID support for humanitarian operations and civil society programs in opposition-controlled territories could achieve similar objectives. Funding groups that would fight Assad, building networks that could be leveraged for intelligence purposes, maintaining American influence in territories contested between multiple armed factions. The contractor loophole made these operations feasible. Implementing partners could conduct transactions with Syrian opposition groups that had connections to designated terrorist organizations, could operate in territories where al-Qaeda affiliates exercised authority, and could fund networks that included individuals with terrorist affiliations, all without violating grant terms that didn't require counterterrorism financing compliance that would make such operations impossible. Afghanistan demonstrated the pattern over 2 decades. USAID spent billions on development programs implemented by contractors operating throughout the country. The programs genuinely built infrastructure, delivered healthcare, and improved agricultural production. They also inevitably involved transactions with networks connected to Taliban, who controlled substantial portions of rural Afghanistan and imposed taxes on virtually all economic activity in those regions. Requiring strict counter-terrorism financing compliance would have forced withdrawal from Taliban-influenced areas, abandoning populations and ceding influence entirely to hostile forces. Accepting that contractors would conduct transactions with Taliban-connected networks enabled continued operations despite supporting groups that American military forces were simultaneously combating. The contradiction was resolved through contractual arrangements that separated USAID's legal obligations from contractors' operational practices. I remember the comparison to banking regulations and recognizing the double standard. Financial institutions conducting a fraction of the transactions that USAID contractors conducted with terrorist-connected networks would face criminal prosecution, regulatory sanctions, and reputational destruction. Banks maintained elaborate compliance systems, conducted extensive due diligence, and faced severe consequences when transactions violated counter-terrorism financing restrictions. But USAID contractors operating in the same environments, moving comparable amounts of money, conducting transactions with the same designated groups, faced no such requirements or consequences. The disparity reflected different regulatory frameworks, but also revealed different operational purposes. Banks were expected to prevent terrorism financing. USAID contractors were expected to maintain strategic presence in conflict zones, which required transactions that would violate counterterrorism financing restrictions if those restrictions applied. The Inspector General's 2025 report recommended that USAID incorporate counterterrorism financing provisions in all grants and cooperative agreements. The recommendation was obvious, so obvious that its absence for 30 years couldn't be explained as oversight. The OIG was essentially recommending that USAID close a loophole that had been deliberately maintained, because it served operational purposes that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The agency's response to the recommendation would be revealing. Implementing it would constrain operations in conflict zones, increase costs, create legal liability for contractors, and potentially force withdrawal from territories where maintaining presence was strategically valuable. Refusing it would confirm that the loophole was intentional rather than accidental, that USAID valued operational flexibility over counterterrorism financing compliance, and that the agency's strategic utility depended partly on its ability to conduct transactions that other government entities couldn't legally conduct. The likely outcome was partial implementation requirements that appeared to address the OIG's concerns while maintaining sufficient flexibility that operations could continue largely unchanged. The language would be carefully crafted to require counterterrorism financing compliance in principle, while providing exceptions for operational circumstances where strict compliance was impracticable. The result would be documented compliance with reformed requirements, while operational practices continued enabling transactions that were problematic but necessary for maintaining strategic presence. I remember standing back from this examination and recognizing that the terrorist financing loophole was final piece completing the picture of USAID's dual mandate. The agency conducted genuine development work that improved lives, delivered humanitarian assistance to vulnerable populations, and built infrastructure that created lasting benefits. It simultaneously served as instrument of American power, conducting operations that advanced strategic interests through methods that couldn't withstand transparent scrutiny. The contractor loophole was essential to both functions. It enabled humanitarian operations in conflict zones where strict counterterrorism financing compliance would force withdrawal. It also enabled strategic operations funding proxy forces, maintaining presence. So that's the story, not polished or glorious, but worn, wind-beaten, and real. If you're still with me through these hours, thank you for sharing this examination of power, for letting these documents drift across your night, for staying present while we traced the architecture of deniability from its 1948 origins. Through 6 decades of operations conducted under developmental cover, we began in Part 1 with structured the legislative foundation, the budget mechanics, the organizational charts that revealed USAID's protected status and global reach. We documented Kennedy's 1961 consolidation of 13 separate aid programs, Congress's 1998 legislative protection making the agency nearly impossible to eliminate, the transparency infrastructure of USA Spend.gov that revealed transactions without explaining motives. We traced evolution from Cold War competition with Soviet influence to contemporary strategic objectives, pharmaceutical dependencies through PEP4, presence across 100 countries, service to State Department priorities that often contradicted development effectiveness. We saw the architecture, we understood the foundation. We recognized that USAID wasn't failing at its mission, it was succeeding at a mission the public had never fully understood and Congress only partially acknowledged. Tonight, in Part 2, we followed that architecture into operation. We traced lineage from George Kennan's 1948 vision of organized political warfare conducted outside CIA oversight, through NSC 10-2's establishment of plausible deniability as operational principle. 2 contemporary programs where the line between humanitarian mission and covert action has blurred until it disappeared. We documented the Foreign Policy Information Warp, CIOP, techniques developed abroad, migrating inward after the Smith-Mundt firewall fell in 2012. Media development programs that created coordinated networks maintaining cover as independent. Journalism while serving strategic purposes. We examined the organized crime and corruption reporting, Project USAIDs, veto rights over staff hiring, $20 million investment generating 456 arrests and $4.5 billion in fines. Investigative journalism transformed into instrument of foreign policy through funding that undermined the independence journalism requires for credibility. We explored judicial reform as strategic capture programs that absorbed billions building courthouses and installing computers while achieving modest institutional transformation. The perverse incentive prioritizing capital absorption over sustainable reform. The access points and dependencies that served intelligence purposes, whether or not they achieved development objectives. I remembered the fraud and bribery decade-long schemes involving USAID officials and corporate executives. Predictable consequences of operations at scale across countries with varying institutional integrity. Moral hazard inherent to the operational model, the OIG's investigations, documenting that fraud was an exception but structural feature, requiring constant management rather than prevention. We documented aid diversion to adversaries, hundreds of thousands of meals reaching al-Qaeda fighters in Syria, hundreds of millions supporting Taliban through Afghan agricultural programs. The strategic calculation accepting resource capture as cost of maintaining presence in contested territories. we examined the Ideological mission, creep $1.5 million for day in Serbian workplaces, controversial grants to EcoHealth Alliance, LGBT advocacy programs that generated backlash in conservative societies, the tension between universal human rights claims and cultural imperialism accusations. We explored political bias and staff orientation, democracy promotion's inherent politicization, the impossibility of promoting institutional change without redistributing power, the question whether programs served recipient countries' needs or donor countries' strategic interests, and we documented Zangzunio, the fake Cuban Twitter funded through Pakistani humanitarian appropriations, Byzantine corporate structures using Cayman Islands accounts, the lure and switch strategy building subscriber base before introducing political messaging, the surveillance database mapping 60,000 Cubans' demographics and political tendencies. We traced the Senate's blocked oversight staffers having no visibility on this entire operation. Despite explicit jurisdiction, USAID's successful invocation of operational security preventing accountability. The demonstration that operations too dirty for the CIA could be routed through USAID to avoid presidential findings and congressional notification. Finally, we examined the Inspector General's revelation just weeks ago that for 30 years, USAID contractors faced no prohibition on transactions with designated terrorist organizations, the loophole that explained $122 million reaching ISIS, affiliates, and predictable diversions to adversaries across conflict zones, the Get Out of Sponsoring Terrorism free card that enabled operations serving strategic purposes while maintaining legal separation, protecting USAID from direct accountability. USAID emerged from this examination as exactly what it was designed to be in 1961, a mechanism for projecting American power under humanitarian cover. Born from George Kennan's vision of organized political warfare conducted outside CIA oversight, institutionalized by Congress to survive political transitions, operating through global networks of contractors and NGOs that provide plausible deniability, the dual mandate humanitarian mission and strategic utility isn't contradiction. It's the entire point. Development aid that doesn't advance American interests doesn't get funded. Humanitarian programs that can't be weaponized for strategic purposes get deeply prioritized. The agency succeeds when it blurs these lines so thoroughly that even its own staff might not know where development ends and covert action begins. What we've documented here is neither conspiracy nor accident. It's policy documented in congressional testimony, Inspector General reports, grant databases, and the agency's own strategic assessments. The architecture of deniability functions as designed. Operations are conducted through ostensibly independent organizations. Funding flows through channels that maintain separation between strategic purposes and official rhetoric. Personnel operate under developmental cover that enables access and relationships serving intelligence objectives. Contractors conduct transactions that USAID itself couldn't legally conduct, creating space where strategic operations occur while maintaining legal compliance through bureaucratic arrangements. I remembered the human costs, and recognizing they were accepted as operational necessities. Cuban youth who trusted Zunzunio and were abandoned when the operation became unsustainable. Afghan farmers whose assistance indirectly supported Taliban opium production. Syrian populations whose humanitarian aid was captured by terrorist groups. Foreign nationals who worked with USAID programs and faced security risks because their work served strategic purposes beyond what they understood. Personnel who believed they were conducting humanitarian work while operating within systems designed to serve strategic objectives they weren't fully informed about. These costs were known, documented in risk assessments and Inspector General investigations, and accepted because strategic imperatives outweighed humanitarian concerns. The machine operated knowing that people would be harmed, used as instruments for strategic purposes, exposed to risks they didn't understand, abandoned when their utility ended. This wasn't organizational failure. It was successful implementation of dual mandate that prioritized strategic utility over humanitarian effectiveness when the two conflicted. The examination reveals uncomfortable truth. American foreign policy operates through systematic dishonesty about what it actually does and why it does it. Officials claim to promote democracy while conducting operations that violate democratic principles. They claim humanitarian purposes while pursuing strategic objectives. They claim transparency while systematically evading oversight. They claim legal compliance